Welcome back, brothers. I'm Lord. Tonight we have the return of Tyberos, and he's on the hunt for a Primarch. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. Now I want to thank you guys for the support. Now, let's get into the video.
The shrine world of Gathis Corona had once been a place of ordered suffering. Its people had known the measured agonies of imperial life and had accepted them with the dumb endurance of the faithful. The manufactories had rung night and day with the pounding of presses and the scream of cutting beams. Pilgrims had crawled on bleeding knees along the processional causeways. Bond serfs had hauled incense braziers heavier than their own sons. Militia levies had drilled in ash courtyards beneath the stone gaze of saints, whose names none of them could read. The cathedra of the capital hive had risen above it all, mile upon mile of black spires and bronze angels, its bells tolling out the will of distant terror over billions of bowed heads. Now the bells rang without pattern. The whole world had gone to prayer, and none could remember who had taught them the words. Across the labor trenches, across the shell manufactories, across the hab districts welded to the hive flanks like rusted growths, the same chant rolled from unnumbered throats. Men in oil-stained work shifts mouthed it, while their hands still moved over sacred engine parts. Militiamen muttered it, while loading magazines into trembling autoguns. Pilgrims whispered it with split tongues as they dragged their scarified bodies toward altars that had not stood there the day before. Prison gangs in shock collars sang it in iron harmony. Servo skulls clicked and stuttered, then repeated fragments of it in broken machine voices as they drifted through the smog. No one remembered learning the syllables. No one knew their meaning, yet every mouth found them. The words were old, older than the Imperium that claimed the world, older than the ecclesiarchy that had chained Gathis Corona in incense and obedience. They rose now from the species' memory, like drowned corpses floating free of a Black Sea floor. Colchisian, liturgical, serpentine in cadence and rich with the cadence of revelation and doom. Above the capital hive, the void burned. Orbital stations had ceased transmitting proper recognition cant 2 days before. Navy pickets had answered hails with broken scripture. Monitors assigned to patrol the pilgrim lanes had fallen from formation and begun tracing vast sigils with their drive flares, writing heretical geometry across near space in lines of burning promethium. Astropathic choirs had died in locked chambers, their blind faces splitting from within as though something vast had tried to speak through their flesh and found it too frail to contain the message. The Administratum archive towers had been set afire by their own scribes. The confessor legates had torn the aquilae from their vestments and preached with streaming blood in place of tears. At the summit of the capital hive stood the cathedral of the last illumination. It had once been a masterpiece of imperial devotion. It was that no longer. Its lower tiers had been swallowed beneath newly raised walls of fused hab, blocks, and overturned battle tanks. Macro statuary lay broken and recast into fresh buttresses, held together by weld seams the size of roads and sealed in drying gore. Entire avenues of tenements had been torn down and fed into its growth. Human bones were mortared into the outer skin in their millions, arranged in script bands that curled around its towers in vast devotional lines. Pilgrim corpses had been nailed beneath the parapets with their rib cages spread open like icons. Lehman Russ hulls and chimera carcasses jutted from the walls as if the building had eaten an armored column and left only metal vertebrae half exposed. Upon the highest altar platform, where a saint of the ecclesiarchy had once been enthroned in gold and marble, dark apostle Malach Vol raised his crozius and watched a city die in worship. He stood in crimson armor blackened by ash and old blood, every plate inscribed with scripture. Chains of finger bones hung from his pauldrons. Parchments made from flensed skin stirred around him in the hot wind. His helm was fashioned in the old word-bearer's style, stern and priestly, its grillwork worked into a perpetual sermon snarl. Beneath his crozius head, a bound demon muttered in joy every time fresh blood struck the metal. Below him, the sacrifice proceeded in ordered tides. Columns of the condemned were driven forward by legionaries and cult enforcers. Some were captured priests, still wearing the torn remnants of imperial robes. Some were militia officers. Some were manufactorum overseers, dragged from counting pits. Most were merely common laborers, selected at random from the billions below, because random death was also a form of sermon, and terror was the surest catechism of all. They were brought before the basalt blocks in tens and scores and hundreds. Their throats were opened, their chests were split, their hearts were heaped in brass bowls, large enough to drown a man. Malakfol lifted his head to the blood haze above the hive and breathed deep. This was not butchery. This was doctrine made manifest. He felt the warp pressing against the veil, eager as a predator scenting an opened wound. He felt the old words resonating through the city, vibrating in every habstack, every bunker chapel, every shattered shrine. Gathis Corona had not simply fallen. It was being rewritten, reauthored, claimed from false faith, and restored to truer purpose. A Coripaus mounted the altar stair and knelt, one gauntlet pressed to his chest. His armor was the deep red of coagulated blood, trimmed in tarnished bronze. His helm was mag-locked to his belt, revealing a scalp branded with scripture, and eyes gone too bright from long exposure to things that hated reality. "The lower vaults are opened, Lord," he said. "The astropathic flesh is spent. The choir towers are silent. The fleet stations no longer answer in machine code. All Vox returns are given in the 9th canticle." Malakvol smiled within his helm. Then, "The world remembers." "It remembers him," said the Coripaus. At that word, every Astartes on the altar bowed his head, not in fear, not only in reverence. In the presence of that pronoun, lesser titles became obscenities. Him. Malak lowered his crozius toward the city. "Continue. Let the bond serfs drown the lower processional districts in pitch. Let the militia see their homes burn while they chant. Let the priests be nailed alive to the Saint Road and hear their own congregations praise the truth with unfamiliar tongues. It will be done." And the void? Still no sign of relief from the carrion fleets of the Corpse Emperor. The local defense monitors have slain 3 merchant convoys and immolated 2 pilgrim hulks in low anchor. Their captains answered final hails with the Book of Lorgar. Malak turned his gaze heavenward, beyond the spires and smoke, beyond the blinking gun batteries and shield projectors, toward the red wound across the sky. The great rift stained the darkness like a torn artery. It filled the nights of Gathis Corona with a permanent false dawn, a bruised and hellish crimson that never quite faded. Lorgar's shadow lay long already. He had not yet set foot upon this world, nor had he need. A priest, somewhere in the lower hive, began to scream in Colchizian. Others took up the cry. An entire district answered him. Malak spread his arms. "Behold," he voxed across the city networks seized from the dead Imperials. "Behold the frailty of false unity. Behold the hollow empire of the silent throne. Its priests burn, its saints crack, its astropaths burst with truth. Its fleets forget their numbers and answer only with devotion. This is revelation. This is the first wound." His amplified voice rolled over the hive. Millions fell prostrate. Millions more kept working while tears streamed down soot-blackened faces. Trains packed with chanting labor corpses continued to grind along their rails, even after the drivers had slit their own throats at the controls. Then the Auspex shrines began to toll. Not the cathedral bells, not the warning klaxons of the hive. These were harder sounds, uglier and lower, drawn from defense arrays in the orbital bastions and vox bunkers across the upper tiers. Malak turned. A thrall stumbled onto the altar, his eyes flayed out by his own fingernails in devotional fervor. "My lord," he gasped, unmarked vessels translating at the edge of the exclusion ring. No heraldry, no declaration, no parley. The Coryphaeus seized the man by the face and crushed his jaw apart. Identify. The thrall gurgled blood and a few last sounds. Grey, he whispered. Void hunters. No hymns, no request for sanction. They are already moving. Malak went still. Not all loyalists came wrapped in pomp and vox ceremony. Not all of the Emperor's lapdogs announced themselves with challenge scripture and threat displays. There were some who came as the deep ocean came to a bleeding thing, with silence first, and then teeth. He stepped to the altar's edge as the first bombardment hit. The eastern void shield flared into being high over the capital hive, a dome of pale gold spanning districts upon districts. For a heartbeat it held. Then lance fire struck it from above with such concentrated malice that the whole barrier blossomed in layered petals of light, each radiant fold collapsing inward as if a burning flower were closing upon its own heart. Macro cannon rounds followed. Orbital station batteries, already corrupted, answered fire with sacred fury against each other. One defense platform died in a sunburst of plasma and molten debris. Another spun downward, trailing atmosphere and burning crew. Across the lower processional avenues, billions began to run. Not away, not with reason. There was no reason left on Gathis Corona. The masses surged in every direction at once, chanting through broken teeth as they trampled each other into red paste. Militia companies opened fire on phantom orders and scythed down pilgrim columns. Cult overseers roared praises and drove the dead and dying toward pre-marked kill grounds. Armored battalions ploughed through incense fog and human crush alike, their tracks grinding skulls flat on the sacred stone roads. High above it all, grey ships moved without fanfare. No broadcast challenge sounded from them, no proclamation of loyalty, no demand for surrender. Their assault signatures were clean, clipped, and murderous. They shed boarding craft and dropped capsules in mathematically perfect dispersal patterns, each vector aimed not at spectacle, but at nerve centers, command spires, vox bunkers, generatoriums, anti-orbital batteries, traffic control nexuses, the arteries, the throat, the eyes. The Carcharodons had come to feed. In the cold vaults of one descending strike cruiser, no warrior spoke above what was required. Auspex returns flickered over armor glass and helm displays. Kill routes were assigned with curt hand signs and vox clicks. Slaughter geometry resolved into certainty. To lesser chapters, the battle might have seemed confused, a world already mad and further thrown into fire. To the hunters of the outer dark, it was merely prey thrashing under the harpoon. Tyberos stood among his terminators, like a verdict awaiting utterance. Even at stillness, he seemed too large, his tactical dreadnought plate a brutal mass of scarred ceramite and void shark iconography. Chains hung from his war gear like trophies taken from the bellies of enemies. His great lightning claws rested low and patient, their edges dark, their housings thick with dried blood burned black by previous wars. Helm lenses glowed like watchful coals in the launch gloom. Across from him, Te Kahurangi bowed his hooded head as the ship shook under defensive fire. Psychic frost had formed along the joints of his armor. His breathing came slow and measured, but beneath the discipline of it, something strained. Tyberos turned his helm a fraction. Te Kahurangi's voice entered the squad vox as a whisper dragged through a grave. This pressure is not the labor of one apostle, not one warband, not one ritual choir. There is a hand over this world, vast, patient, of the old blood. No one answered at once. They all understood what old blood meant. Not legionary, not sorcerer, not princeps damned or warpsmith swollen with theft. Something from the age of gods and sons. Te Kahurangi continued. I taste scripture in the Empyrean. I taste Kolchis. The veil bends inward, as if reality itself seeks to kneel. Tyberos gave the slightest nod. Then we cut out the tongue. The drop assault began. The failed Imperial commander was dragged from the command bunker, while its walls still shook from melter breaches. He was a general of the planetary defense regiments, though the ruin of his uniform and the filth on his face made him look no different. From the panic, cattle fleeing the avenues outside. His command staff lay around him in pieces where the Carcharodons had butchered their way through the bunker doors. One officer had been nailed to a cogitator bank with his own ceremonial sword. Another had been split from collar to pelvis by a chain blade blow so hard the halves had fallen in opposite directions. Tyberos loomed over the general, while assault squads secured the chamber. "Name the architect," said the Shade Lord. The man stared upward, trying and failing to find anything human in that helm. "I served," he babbled. "I held the southern guns for 3 days. The fleet broke. The priests turned. The astropaths died. We could not hold." Tyberos drove one claw tip through the man's shoulder and pinned him to the bunker map table. The scream was brief. Shock devoured the rest. "Fleet routes," Tyberos said. The general gasped them out. "Cipher keys." Those followed in a flood of blood and snot and terror. The architect. The commander tried to bargain then. Men always did. He offered names of local traitors. He offered bunker locations. He offered the governor's sealed transit path and the passphrases of the last loyal armored reserve. Tyberos listened with all the mercy of the abyss, then twisted the buried claw. At last the answer came. "Malak Vol," the man shrieked. "Word-bearer, apostle. He took the cathedral heights. He says this world is only the first mouthful. Mercy. By the throne. Mercy." Tyberos withdrew the claw. For a moment the general thought he might live. The Shade Lord severed his head with a single backhand blow and let the corpse slide from the map table in arterial sheets. "Advance," he voxed. Outside the bunker, the war for the capital hive had become a vision from the death spasms of a god. Orbital strikes walked across the upper tiers in straight lines of annihilation, each impact lifting hab towers into the air as glowing fragments before the pieces rained down into the running crowds below. Void shield projectors failed one after another. Whole districts burned in concentric circles around ruptured promethium lines. Cult infantry surged in masses so vast they resembled weather fronts, banners and sensors waving above tide after tide of screaming flesh. Tanks crushed through processional avenues, choked with the bodies of pilgrims, too slow to clear their tracks. Penitent walkers strode into machine gun fire, while priests nailed to their hulls preached until rounds took their jaws away. The Carcharodons did not answer this madness with sermons. They answered it with applied extinction. Assault claws hit command bunkers and cracked them open in minutes. Boarding torpedoes punched through the roofs of traitor strongpoints and disgorged grey killers into the heart of their own fortifications. Predator tanks fired in measured sequence, each shell selected for command vox arrays, munition dumps, engine, decks. Devastator squads took the upper ledges and stripped advancing armor to flame and molten tracks. Where the word-bearers made a rite of horror, the Carcharodons made an economy of it. Malak Vol watched the loyalist strike sever his outer command lattice and felt savage delight bloom in his secondary heart. At last, real hunters. He ordered the lower districts put to the torch. He ordered fresh sacrifices stacked on the shield shrines. He ordered the cult masses to hold the avenues not because victory was possible there, but because blood spent in panic and obedience still nourished the deeper work. Far below, Tyberos found the Coryphaus amidst the wreck of a traitor redoubt, breached by terminators and drowned in bolter smoke. The word-bearer had lost both legs below the knee and one arm at the elbow. He still spat catechisms through broken teeth and tried to crawl toward his fallen Crozius. Tyberos planted a ceramite boot on his spine and bent until vertebrae cracked, like dry timber. "Sicarus," said the Shade Lord, "speak." The Coryphaus laughed wetly. "You think this world matters." Tyberos cut away the other arm. The laugh became a howl. Takahurangi stood nearby, helm tilted, sensing the currents gathering around the dying traitor like sharks in black water. "What is being prepared?" Tyberos asked. The Coryphaus coughed blood over the stone. "A gospel, a living word, a sermon for the wider dark. Whole sectors will kneel, and never know when the kneeling began." Tyberos tore away another piece. "Who prepares it?" The traitor's ruined face split in something like ecstasy. "He does." The air changed, not with the random filth of lesser sorcery, not with the shriek of demons clawing at weak points in reality. This was heavier, colder, vast as architecture. The burning city seemed to pause around it. The flames bent inward. The vox traffic on every open channel dissolved into static and then into chanting. Even the wounded made no sound for one impossible heartbeat. The Coryphaus's throat moved, though half the neck was gone. A new voice emerged from the ruin of him, deep and measured and filled with ancient contempt. Tyberos. For the first time since planetfall, several Carcharodons looked toward their lord. The voice continued through the shredded corpse, as if flesh were no barrier, as if a dead or dying Astartes were merely another lectern from which revelation might be read. "I have watched your kind from the edge of history. Silent predators, blind servants. You come seeking an apostle and find a scripture." The corpse's jaw unhinged wider than bone allowed. Black blood ran up from the floor into the wound instead of down. Takahurangi dropped to one knee, one gauntlet pressed to the ground. "Shade Lord," he hissed over the vox. "The pressure is real. Primarch." The dead Coryphaus smiled with half a face. "Come deeper into the wound, hunter," said Lorgar Aurelian. "Come into the eye." The fleet crossed the threshold of the eye like a blade passing through infected flesh. There was no clean translation, no moment of orderly breach in which the laws of the void yielded to the laws of the warp with dignified malice. The stars did not vanish. They ruptured. Constellations stretched into red seams, as if some giant and unseen claw had scored the black between worlds and opened it into bleeding depth. Light bent wrong. Distances became devotional errors. Every Auspex shrine aboard every strike vessel flooded with readings too profane to be machine truth and too precise to be madness. Hull plates groaned from stem to stern, as though the void itself had fastened broken teeth into the fleet and was worrying each ship between its jaws. Within those iron bellies, men died at their stations, without understanding why. Some were mortal engine hands, whose hearts simply stopped when the Geller wards dipped against a surge of empiric pressure that looked upon them and found them unworthy of endurance. Some were rating serfs, whose eyes clouded with milk-white opacity before they began reciting fragments of scripture in languages they had never heard in waking life. One whole auger deck aboard the Nicor was found kneeling, every operator with his forehead split open against his own cogitator bank, each corpse bowed toward the same impossible heading in the dark. The Carcharodons did not waste speech on the dead. Their fleet entered hell as it entered war, with silence and discipline. Along the arming decks of the strike cruisers and battle barges, grey armoured giants sat upon iron benches or stood before weapon racks in ranks of utter stillness, their restraint harder and more terrible than panic. They sharpened chain teeth. They cleaned bolter-feed housings with slow exactness. They checked seals, maglocks, servo tension, targeting overlays, reserve charge levels. The old rites of readiness performed not as ceremony, but as murder made orderly. No warrior boasted. No warrior prayed aloud. The only voices were the rasp of files against ceramite, the clack of fresh magazines seating home, the low growl of machine spirits being soothed by gauntleted touch and ancestral habit. On one deck, a veteran of the Red Brethren used the hooked point of a combat blade to carve fresh oath scrimshaw into his vambrace. The letters were not decorative. They bit deep. Promises of flesh, silence, and red ruin cut into old scars and older names. Beside him, another warrior received the gene seed canister from a fallen brother slain upon Gathis Corona. He knelt before the apothecary without flourish, while the sealed relic ampule was placed within the shrine vault. No lament followed. Nothing was spoken, save the formal transfer of lineage and debt. Their dead did not require grief. Their dead required remembrance and repayment. Further inward, where the mortal crews were forbidden to tread, unless summoned or dragged, Takahurangi stood in the drowned blue half-light of the librarius vault and listened to the fleet complain. He heard it through the walls, through the deck, through the slow, tortured hum of reactor song and the mutter of caged machine spirits forced to endure passage through a sea inimical to all rightful form. The eye pressed against the hull as a living theological argument. It sought entry with persuasion where violence failed. It whispered against the ship in 1,000 stolen voices. Sometimes it sounded like drowned children, sometimes like old void masters long flensed and burned, sometimes like his own voice, speaking words he had not yet chosen. Around him, the navigators sat strapped into brass thrones and restraint frames, their third eyes veiled in chains of silver and sanctified lead. Blood seeped from beneath those bindings. One had already died. The pressure of the way had opened his warp sight too wide, and what stared back through it had stripped the flesh from his mind in an instant. His corpse still convulsed upon the throne, while attendant serfs in blindfolds and prayer hooks worked to cut it free. Takahurangi placed one gauntlet against the ward stone of the chamber wall and let his consciousness move outward into the convulsing currents beyond the Geller Veil. He felt them at once, not tides, intention. The route to Sicarus had not been left to chance. It had been prepared. Across the storm lanes burned the ritual beacons of the word-bearers, each one a wound set deliberately into the dark. Corpse lanterns hung in empty reaches where no stars should have been, globes fashioned from flensed skin and stretched over brass frameworks, each lantern burning not with promethium, but with soul light. Sacrificial signal worlds turned slowly beneath the madness, planets stripped of cities and forests, and atmosphere until only skinless continents remained, their exposed crusts carved with colossal scripture, visible from orbit. Mast. Pyres burned across those dead surfaces in geometric patterns that functioned as navigation liturgy. Whole populations had died merely to mark the way. Takahurangi exhaled once, slowly, his breath frosting inside his helm. On the command dais above the forward vaults, Tyberos watched the impossible with predator patience. The bridge lumen strips had been dimmed to blood glow. Rune priests and void tacticians worked in the hush proper to a fleet that had abandoned all expectation of mercy. Hollow displays guttered and reformed with maddening frequency, showing processional paths of damned light winding through impossible spatial folds. Out beyond the armored viewports, stars moved like opened wounds dragged across black skin. A void master bowed over his station. "The beacons are drawing us inward, Lord. Each route away is fouled. Each safe translation vector collapses into storm." Tyberos did not turn. "Then we go inward." Nothing more. The words were flat as execution, blocks. Yet they changed the tenor of the bridge more utterly than any shouted exhortation might have done. Orders became simpler after that. Fire solutions were adjusted. Formation discipline tightened. Reserve boarding claws were brought forward. Magazines and torpedo racks were reallocated for close void murder rather than long-range exchange. No one asked whether deeper entry into the eye was wise. Wisdom had no place there. There was only hunt or failure. The first clash came when the storm opened its fist. Slave arcs spilled from a curtain of writhing static like rot shaken from a wound. They came by the scores, then by the hundreds, gigantic and misshapen vessels built in layers over centuries by mad creed and need. Cathedral superstructures had been bolted atop cargo hulls. Pilgrim towers rose from their decks like hive stacks on their sides. Some dragged chains of smaller pilgrim craft behind them. Others burned devotional braziers the size of manufacturum districts, filling the void with vapor plumes that turned censer returns into liturgical fog. Behind them moved the real enemy. Word-bearers' warships held station in the deeper dark, screened by masses of expendable human freight. Murder masked behind martyrdom. The slave arks transmitted hymns instead of surrender pleas. Icon haulers opened their launch bays and vomited streams of assault boats packed wall to wall with chanting cultists. Pilgrim flotillas the size of cities rolled across the battle line, their hulls crowded with millions who still knelt in prayer even as point defense batteries began cutting them down. The Carcharodons fired without hesitation. Plasma broadsides struck the leading arc and erased an entire habitation spine in a flare of white-blue sunfire. For a heartbeat, the vessel remained whole around the wound. Then its forward decks blew outward in a cloud of steel ribs, burning statues, and human bodies. Millions died in that first discharge. Their deaths were too many to register as individuals. They became atmosphere, debris, thermal noise. A city died and became dust before the second salvo landed. Macro shells followed. Pilgrim hulls burst apart like rotten fruit beneath the impacts. Decompression dragged screaming multitudes into the void in river currents of blood, parchment, reliquaries, and frozen limbs. One cathedrum ship, its central nave visible through shattered armor glass, split cleanly along its spine and spilled 10,000 cultists into open space. They tumbled end over end in processional robes aflame, mouths still moving in hymn. The fires on their garments continued to burn for a few impossible moments before the vacuum and the cold swallowed them. The traitor screen kept coming. Slave pilots locked their drives and hurled their vessels bodily at the grey warships. Boarding hooks streaked out in clusters. Repurposed freighters crammed with human bomb offerings drove straight into defensive torpedo patterns and vanished in sacred detonations bright enough to shadow other ships for an instant. Icon haulers vented whole decks of pilgrims into the guns of the loyalists, spending lives as interference, using human mass as auspex clutter and moral insult alike. Tyberos watched a word-bearer's cruiser reveal itself behind the burning husk of an ark. Its flanks were crimson black, scripture lit by interior furnace glow, where armor plates had been peeled away and replaced with iron grillwork. Its launch bays blazed with a fresh wave of attack craft. Its prow icon was a book impaled upon a sword. He raised one claw and pointed. "Board!" The order cracked across the command vox. Boarding torpedoes launched in immediate answer, black cylinders of compressed wrath hurling themselves into the fire-lit wreckage between fleets. Tyberos rode in the foremost assault shell with the Red Brethren packed around him, every warrior locked in mag clamps, while the hull rang with impact alarms and near misses. The torpedo struck amidships. Ceramite screamed. Explosive bolts fired. The assault petals blew outward into a corridor already full of smoke, corpses, and bolter flash. Tyberos came through first. The initial impact of his armored bulk broke a word-bearer at the waist. The traitor folded backward over a shattered bulkhead spar, his spine exiting through his own breastplate in a spray of black blood and fragmented ribs. The Shade Lord did not slow. One lightning claw punched through the helm of a second legionary and opened half his skull like a ripe shell. The other scissored across 3 mortal deckhands in a single sweep, leaving only a red mist and limbs still clutching tools. The corridor became murder at touching distance. Chain blades snarled until they clogged on rib cages. Bolters fired so close that armor and flesh detonated together in sheets across the walls. Terminator plate ground forward over piled dead, crushing broken limbs and split torsos under adamant tread. The word-bearers fought with snarling catechisms and disciplined fury, red ceramite slick with blood and oil, Crozius wielders shouting invocations of Colchis as they drove their brethren into countercharge. It bought them seconds, nothing more. A possessed thing hurled itself from an upper gantry, its flesh writhed through with brass hooks and script brands. One of the Red Brethren caught it on his chain fist and tore it into a rope of organs before its claws reached Tyberos. Another traitor legionary jammed a blade into the neck seam of a Carcharodon Terminator and died a moment later when Tyberos tore both his arms away and beat him to death with them. The corridor floor disappeared beneath corpses so quickly that footing became uncertain. Marines fought atop the dead, slipping in blood, using walls and ceiling braces for leverage, while muzzle flashes strobed over flensed faces and shattered aquilae. The air grew thick with propellant vapor, venting plasma, atomized bone, and the copper stench of opened bodies. Somewhere aft, a reactor alarm began to moan. Somewhere forward, a whole compartment blew open to vacuum and dragged men and wreckage screaming into the dark. The Carcharodons drove on. They took the transit spine, then the sanctum lifts, then the inner command cloister, where no common crew were permitted entry. There, behind doors plated in scripture and hung with strips of skin-bearing warding text, they found not treasure, but arithmetic for the end of worlds. The sanctum chamber was circular and high-vaulted, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with chained codices, data shrines, and skin scrolls stretched upon bronze frames. Hollow projectors displayed sector charts overlaid with devotional sigils and trigger litanies. Cogitator banks chattered through lists of hive worlds, shrine worlds, forge dependencies, pilgrim routes, underhive cells, cell leaders, phrase keys, response cants, and doctrinal contamination thresholds. Entire populations had been reduced to ledgers of conversion and death. One wall was given over to sacrificial tallies, not names, not persons, totals. Billions already offered in Lorgar's name, billions rendered into quantities of faith pressure, signal strength, choir fuel, beacon blood, and sermon reach. Whole worlds marked with the stages of corruption required for ignition. Some were already burning, some were merely seeded, some were waiting upon a word. Takahurangi entered behind the first wave and went very still. "This is not conquest," he said. "It is synchronization." A red brother ripped a data spindle free of its shrine mount, blood and sacred oil dripping from the cables. Another began cutting whole parchment runs from the walls with his combat blade. The fleet tacticians would want every scrap, every cipher, every route. Tyberos looked over the vast list of worlds and saw the scale of the prey. Not one warband, not one apostle, not one infected shrine world. A campaign of scripture and slaughter spread across the dark like a net cast by patient hands. Far away, upon the altar heights of a world already half consumed by fire and praise, Malak Fol received the first reports of the captured sanctum and felt satisfaction colder than joy. He stood once more above his mass sacrifices, while the air trembled with heat and gunfire from the void battle overhead. Another wave of victims died at the blocks below him, their blood sluicing through channels cut to mirror old Colchizian sigils. The Coryphas at his side finished the transmission from the surviving fleet element and bowed. "They have taken the ship, Lord. They have the route ledgers, the activation ciphers, the tallies." Malak lowered his gaze to the sacrificial bowls brimming black in the red light. "Good." The Coryphas hesitated. "Good, Lord?" "Did you think the hunter would come if shown an empty trail?" Malak said. "Let him gorge on selected truth. Let him believe he is cutting toward the throat. Let him take the marked paths. Let him break the locks we wish broken and kill the mouths we no longer require." He turned to look toward the great rift, its crimson stain throbbing across the sky like an open vein. "He is being drawn." Back aboard the captured Word-Bearer's cruiser, the Carcharodons completed their sweep with customary thoroughness. Engine shrines were purged, Surviving serfs were put down. Ammunition vaults were taken or vented. Machine spirits too corrupted to redeem were silenced with melter and consecrated overload. The dead lay where they had fallen, stacked in corridors, sprawled over consoles, tangled in boarding scars and ruptured blast doors. Blood ran in the deck grooves in slow black streams. Then the vox channels opened by themselves, not with a shriek, not with the crude static howl of demonic intrusion. The sound came cleanly, almost reverently, through every helm grill and command shrine aboard the seized vessel. Several dead crewmen twitched where they lay. A mortal servitor, its skull half removed by a bolt detonation, pushed itself upright against all reason, its split jaw clacking. Then every corpse on the deck opened its mouth. Human, legionary, servitor, bridge officer, men with no throats left to form sound, men whose lower jaws had been shot away, men already cooling in their own blood. The same voice came through all of them, deep and patient and vast enough to fill the ship until the steel seemed to bow around it. Come deeper. No one on the deck spoke. Again the dead mouths moved. Come deeper. A third time, with the whole captured cruiser answering like a cathedral of meat and ruin. Come deeper. Sicarus did not rise from the madness of the eye as a world. It hung in the Empyrean like a sentence still being written by a diseased god. From orbit, its continents resembled pages of blackened vellum stretched over the bones of a dead giant. Mountain. Ranges were cut in lines too deliberate for nature. Vast ridges carved with scripture so immense that whole regiments could march for weeks along the grooves of a single letter and never reach its end. Storms rolled through the valleys, not as weather, but as bruised curtains of ash and incandescent dust, each thunderhead lit from within by faces that formed and dissolved among the folds. Cathedral cities clung to flesh hills that pulsed beneath their own foundations, their buttresses pinned by chains the size of voidcraft moorings into red meat that never ceased its slow and miserable twitching. Black seas spread between the land masses like pools of polished obsidian, and in those waters there moved reflections of wars fought 10,000 years before. The betrayal at Istvan burned again in liquid silhouette. Monarchia fell forever in broken gold. Calth bled beneath a poisoned sun with every tide. Above all of it hung other cities. They dangled upside down from the cloud banks, suspended by spires of brass, bone, and impossible geometry, their towers thrusting earthward instead of heavenward, their bells tolling into the abyss below. Between those inverted metropolis masses, there drifted chains of shrines, bridgeways, gallows, and procession platforms, all crowded with the dead, the soon-to-die, and the ecstatic. No part of Sicarus was accidental. No atrocity existed without function. No scream rose unwitnessed. Dark Apostle Malakfol stood upon the parapet of the sermon citadel of Varadesh and looked out across the arterial plain below. He did not see disorder. He saw a machine vast enough to devour sectors. He saw doctrine with topography for flesh. He saw the architecture of conquest in its truest form, not expressed in simple fortification lines or massed armor thrusts, but in obedience arranged over geography and pain distributed with sacred precision. Below the citadel walls, the roadways seethed. They were not roads in the imperial sense, though they served transport well enough. They were broad ritual channels paved in fused bone, iron slag, and scorched stone, each wide enough to carry armored columns abreast, each inscribed in the old Colchizian script with litanies visible from the upper towers. Human tribute clogged them from horizon to horizon. Millions of slaves shuffled beneath electro-scourges and bronze hook goads, their backs bent under crates of munitions, cathedral stone, promethium urns, skin scrolls, ration bricks, shell casings, caged infants, and relic cages containing things that still moved when the light struck them. Some tribute streams fed the demon engine forges. Some climbed toward the sermon citadels. Some descended into the breeding pits, those colossal red sinkholes where generations of stolen stock were raised for labor, sacrifice, or war, depending on the planetary calculus of need. Between the roads rose foundries and manufactories blacker than void holes, their chimneys coughing sparks and greasy smoke into the bruised sky. There, slave-smiths and warp-sworn artificers hammered plates for corrupted armor, shaped shell casings blessed with catechism, and riveted brass scripture into the hides of demon engines screaming upon restraint racks. Elsewhere, the skinning halls rendered the dead into parchment, vellum, lampshade membrane, drum hide, banner leather, and nutrient reclaim. Nothing was wasted. Not blood, not marrow, not terror, not faith. This was why lesser minds never understood the 17th Legion. They saw pyres, chanting, mutation, possessed things slithering through incense, and they named it madness because they lacked the courage to perceive structure inside horror. Malak knew better. Every execution that blackened a plaza was cited for line of sight and morale effect. Every hanging field was measured for traffic pause, devotional fear, and optimum congestion of witnesses. Every sacrificial trench, every labor camp, every shrine tower, every orbital, beacon and choir pit fed the larger geometry of transmission. Sicarus was not merely a demon world, it was a theological engine, a factory of belief and terror, a forge in which conquest was manufactured long before any fleet made translation into a target system. He turned from the parapet as his Coryphaus approached through the incense haze of the upper hall. The warrior knelt and struck a gauntlet against his breastplate. "Lord, the inner council is convened." Malak inclined his head and passed through the bronze valve doors into the hall of unfinished revelation. The chamber was circular, sunk deep beneath the upper sanctum towers. Its walls were lined in ascending tiers with chained scribes, each seated upon iron stools before slanted desks of skin and brass. Hundreds of them scratched endlessly with bone styluses, copying liturgies, fleet dispositions, target worlds, compliance estimates, activation sequences, casualty cants, sacrificial tallies, and sermons still in draft. None of them looked up as Malak entered. Their eyes remained on the texts before them, with the fearful devotion of men who knew that to miswrite even a single syllable might see them flayed alive and made into corrected parchment by evening. Around the central floor stood the gathered masters of the local host, dark apostles, warpsmiths, Coryphos commanders, the overseers of the breeding pits, the keeper of the beacon pyres, the master of the skin foundries, a sorcerer with half his face bound behind silver nails, veteran legionaries all, murderers, priests, administrators of apocalypse. At the far end of the chamber, beyond the central brazier where black fire burned without heat, there was no throne. There was only a suspended curtain of crimson vapor, as if a wound had been cut into the air and held open by will alone. The council began with reports, supply vectors from the outer tributary worlds, proof of doctrinal spread in nearby sectors, updated figures of planetary conversion across 3 shrine systems touched by the first sermons from Gathis Corona. A warpsmith recited the readiness of siege engines and macro-litany arrays. Another detailed the required blood volume for the next phase of beacon intensification. All of it mattered. All of it was precise. The old lie that the servants of chaos were incapable of discipline had been written by fools and believed by cowards. Then the crimson vapor deepened. One of the scribes faltered, not in his hand, in his breathing. Malak felt it at once, a pressure behind the eyes, a gravity in the soul. Veteran Astartes around the chamber lowered themselves to one knee without being commanded. Every helm bowed, every voice silenced. The black fire in the brazier bent inward, as if drawn by an unseen wind. He had not come in fullness. Even so, the chamber could not bear much of him. A voice moved within the vapor, not loud, not shouted, but heavy enough that the stone beneath Malak's boots seemed to remember being molten. Speak. No title accompanied it. No announcement. None was needed. Malak bowed his head deeper. The Gathis operation concludes in our favor. The loyalist hunters have taken the marked path. They carry the ledgers you permitted them to claim. They come. It was not a question. Yes. The crimson deepened further. The air became difficult to draw into the lungs. One of the scribes, a weak stock from some half-conquered underhive, glanced up by reflex. He made the mistake of trying to see through the vapor. The unfinished word that followed from within the curtain was not even a complete sentence. It was only the beginning of one. The first turn of a thought too great for mortal frame. The scribe screamed and clawed both his eyes from his face with his own fingers before the second syllable had finished forming. He toppled from his stool, kicking and gibbering while blood ran down his cheeks. 3 others nearby, hearing too, much though not seeing enough, began shrieking prayers and raking their styluses across their own eyelids until their vision burst. Panic tried to rise among the chained scribes in widening rings, but the nearest Corifhouse moved at once, breaking necks, silencing throats, restoring order through efficient violence. The voice within the vapor ceased before the sentence could complete. The silence afterward was more terrible than the sound had been. Malak kept his head bowed, his twin hearts hammered against his ribcage with reverence and animal fear. He had stood before demon princes and unmade worlds. He had heard the shrieks of cities peeled open in worship. None of it touched the soul like that fragment of withheld revelation. After a span that might have been a breath or an hour, the voice returned. "The hunter," Malak answered immediately. "Tyberos, Lord, the Carcharodon warlord. He is useful." Malak dared not look up. "As you will. The sea, beast will cut where he is permitted to scent blood. Let him sever the old tongues. Let him think the body can die through loss of lesser organs." "Yes, Lord." The black fire flared, the vapor thinned by a hair. "Prepare the word." Malak pressed his forehead to the stone. When he rose again, the crimson wound in the air had narrowed. The pressure lifted just enough for breath to cease tasting of hot iron and old scripture. Around him, veteran legionaries remained kneeling, some with black blood leaking from the corners of their eyes, none daring to wipe it away. The council ended in perfect silence. Far above Sicarus, in the cold shadow of a debris field composed of the faithful dead and the broken hulls of older wars, Tyberos refused the strategy placed before him. The hololithic display hanging in the strike cruiser's war chamber showed the principal defenses of the demon world in shifting red runes, orbital bastions, interlocking void shield shrines, macro, cannon crowns sunk into mountain scripture, kill satellites, pilgrim swarm screens, fleet tethers, hidden anchor fortresses nested under the inverted cities. Any conventional invasion would require prolonged void engagement, massed landing waves, secured beachheads, and a supply chain robust enough to endure the attritional appetite of the eye. It would also give the word-bearers time. Tyberos stared at the world turning beneath them and saw not a fortress planet, but a carcass with arteries. "A landing would bleed us for nothing," said one Voidmaster. Tyberos's helm turned slightly. "Then do not land." The chamber understood at once. No line engagement, no grand declaration, no drawn-out beachhead war against a prepared demon world fattened on sacrifice and expectation. A hunt. Takahurangi stood near the edge of the hollow field, hood shadowing his face, one gauntlet resting against the pommel of his force stave. He had spent long hours gazing through warded lenses at the surface below, and what he had learned left the warp frost on his armor thicker than before. "The world is aware," he said. No one interrupted him. "It is not metaphor. The land answers loss, not as a beast answers pain, but as a scripture reacts to erasure. Each shrine severed matters. Each apostle slain matters, yet each cut will feed the place as much as it weakens the design. Sicarus is both stage and participant. Tyberos looked at him. Can it be killed? Tekahurangi's mouth hardened. Not by us, not here, but its speech can be stammered. That was enough. The orders spread through the fleet in clipped bursts. Kill packs, not companies. Silent insertions. Teleport strikes into weakly shielded arterial nodes. Boarding claws aimed at orbital signal shrines and anchor bastions. No fixed line, no rallying banner, no prolonged engagement beyond target death. Apostles, beacon choirs, transmission pits, relay cathedra, ritual hubs, leadership removal, followed by immediate disappearance before localized retaliation could solidify. It was how a predator fed in dark water. The first kill packs went down through a storm front the size of a continent and emerged into the lower reaches of the Sermon Plains without a sound broader than displaced ash. Grey armored forms ghosted from the murk, their plate blackened, their lenses hooded. Auspex ghosts one instant, violence the next. A signal shrine crew died before their third vox code could complete. The shrine master lost his head to a chainsword blow that also split the lectern behind him and showered the wall in burning parchment. In a breeding pit transit station, overseers were found with their throats pulped inward, every relay console smashed, every gate control fused shut. A warpsmith directing the elevation of a demon engine from forge cradle to battlefield harness was dragged from his gantry and butchered in silence, his body hanging by one tendon while the machine below screamed itself awake and tore apart its own tethering crews. Where the Carcharodon struck, the removal of leadership was immediate and total. Mortal masses did not know what had killed their masters. They only saw red armor falling apart in sprays of blood and the sudden absence of command. Panic followed, delay followed, precious interruption followed. Then the hunters were gone. Tyberos led one such strike himself into a relay basilica, half buried within the flank of a script-cut mountain, whose carved characters were each the size of fortress walls. He and the Red Brethren moved through its interior like knives through a throat. The defenders were veteran word-bearers and their bonded mortal fanatics, but warning never spread far enough. A Coryphaus died with his crozier still half raised. A choir pit of skinned vox thralls was put to the blade in heartbeats. The relay corps went dark under melter fire before the outer barracks had even fully armed. Emerging onto an upper gallery open to the bruised sky, Tyberos looked across the horizon and saw the first manifestation. It walked in the cloud banks. At first it seemed only a distortion in the storm, a vertical break in the bruised light. Then the shape gained form. Robes of fire trailing over impossible height, a silhouette vast enough to stride between cathedral towers, scriptural bands flaring and fading across its outline like words trying to incarnate. No face could be seen at that distance, nor any clean detail of flesh, yet the posture of it carried such authority that the armies below, human and Astartes and abomination alike, reacted as one. Millions fell to their knees. Across the plains, along the roads of tribute, atop battlements, in the shadow of demon forges, in trenches and procession fields and labor camps beyond count, whole masses collapsed in prostration. Guns lowered, whips dropped, tank columns halted with engines snarling. Even some of the dying tried to drag themselves into an attitude of worship before death took them. Tyberos did not kneel, neither did the warriors beside him. Tekahurangi's voice came over the squad channel, thin with controlled strain. He is not there, not holy. It is only projection, pressure, symbol made large enough to command obedience at range. Tyberos watched the burning silhouette stride through the clouds, each step leaving scripture in the storm. Only, he said. The word carried no awe, only hatred sharpened to practical edge. Back aboard the fleet, fragments of the taken ledgers had begun to resolve into a pattern no commander could mistake. World lists cross-referenced with activation cants. Sacrificial tallies aligned to astropathic relay clusters. Choir outbreaks synchronized to pilgrimage routes and underhive devotion economies. Not isolated infestations, not local rebellions, not even the broad infection of a crusade. This was something more subtle and more terrible. A sermon could travel where fleets could not. A word could enter where armies might be resisted. Takahurangi stood before the assembled rune hololiths, while bloodless serfs and armored tacticians worked the data around him. "It is not merely a campaign of conquest," he said. "It is vocal architecture, a contagion made of doctrine, fear, and warp resonance. They are preparing a spoken vector, a sermon that does not require physical presence in order to ignite what has already been planted." The chamber went still. One old void adept found his voice first. "Across how many worlds?" Tekahurangi looked at the glowing lists, at the marked shrines, at the synchronized beacon routes and blood calculations. "Entire sectors." Tyberos stood at the edge of the projection field, vast and motionless as a statue cut from a ship's keel. He understood then that Lorgar was not gathering armies in the simple old way, not merely raising fleets and cults to hurl against the Imperium until one side, drowned in bodies. He was preparing speech as a weapon, a living warp sermon, a contagion of revelation and ruin that could leap from shrine to underhive, from confessor to pilgrim, from astropath to void crewman, from one infected tongue to 100 million more, until worlds rose in praise of damnation without ever seeing the ships that had doomed them. Tyberos's helm inclined towards Sicarus, turning below. Then we cut out the mouth. Planetfall began, as murder performed with liturgical precision. No heralding broadside announced it. No challenge cant rolled ahead of the descent. The fleet above Sicarus had already spent lesser hours on feints, raids, and excisions, drawing forth signal shrines and forcing the word-bearers to reveal which arteries bled doctrine toward the wider void. When the true blow came, it came everywhere at once. Drop pods tore through the bruised cloud layers in black spears of fire, their retro thrusters shrieking as they punched toward them. Sermon plains and the bastion fields beyond. Teleport strikes flared within cathedral keeps, on parapet crowns, in shell towers, in the reliquary depths beneath macro cannon platforms. Each translation burst vomiting grey armored killers into chambers that had known only incense and ordered blasphemy moments before. Boarding torpedoes slammed sideways into cliff fastnesses and hanging shrines anchored to the inverted cities overhead, their explosive petals opening into shrieking chainsword work and bolter thunder. Orbital lance fire walked in straight white lines across anti-ship bastions and outer wall emplacements, burning through brass scripture, meat mortar, and armored cupola alike. Low-flying gunships came after, flying beneath the worst of the void batteries, their hulls black against the storm glow, their weapons washing processional avenues and shrine spires in sheets of explosive ruin. Sicarus answered at once. Macro cannon crowns mounted upon cathedral walls began to thunder from every horizon, not in disorder, but in layered patterns calculated to overlap the likely approach vectors of the attackers. The recoil of each shot shivered through the flesh hills beneath them, making whole districts quiver like opened muscle. Trench systems carved around the bastion zones erupted with movement as billions of cultists surged from dugouts, shrine pits, breach shelters, and devotional catacombs. They came on in robes, in patchwork armor, in worker harness, in militia flak, in naked ash-stained skin cut with scripture. Some carried autoguns, some bore hooked polearms or fire pots or mining lasers or stolen blades. Many came with nothing but frenzy and faith. They filled the ground between fortresses in living tides so vast that they blurred into the land itself, wave after wave of screaming flesh rolling beneath banners of flayed skin and icons of the burning book. Demon engines strode among them. They came lurching from forge mouths and armored transit, pits, immense and hideous, all piston legs, brass fangs, and furnace eyes. Some were shaped in mockery of engines once loyal, their silhouettes still that of battle tanks or walkers, until the light struck the mouths growing from their hulls, or the bound limbs beating against their armor from within. Others were rawer and older, all spine ridges, flesh cables, and iron-plated torsos, dragging chains of ammunition and sacrificial corpses. They advanced through the burning districts with the inevitability of execution, shellfire rippling from their weapons, claws and drilling limbs harvesting those cultists too slow to clear their paths. The trenches became slaughter channels within minutes, where orbital strikes ruptured earthworks. The packed defenders and the charging faithful alike were churned together into rivers of mud and organs. Men fell into shell mouths and vanished beneath the next wave. Heavy bolter fire stitched red paths through cult columns, only for more bodies to climb over the fallen and keep coming, chanting as they drowned in their own dead. Promethium spread through pit lines and trench turns, setting entire sectors alight so that fighters stumbled on while burning, mouths open in hymns as their hair and skin cooked from their skulls. The Carcharodons did not seek to hold ground. They bit and tore. Tyberos led the primary spear through the outer defense ring at the base of the sermon chain, where a linked series of bastions, trenches, and shrine fortresses defended one of the principal avenues climbing toward the inner sanctums. His teleport strike landed in the midst of the first ring of resistance, grey lightning bursting within a battery cloister crowded by red armored elites and chanting human auxiliaries. He came out of the translation haze like a void-born execution. The first word-bearer to turn toward him managed the opening half of a warning. Tyberos's chain fist hit him chest on and bit all the way through. Ceramite burst outward. Ribs and both hearts became pulp between roaring teeth. The shattered corpse slapped against a shrine pillar, hard enough to leave half the spine hanging there. Before the remains had hit the stones, Tyberos's other claw sheared across a second legionary, opening gorget, helm seal, breastplate, and the whole upper ribcage beneath in one wet tearing sweep. The head spun away through the incense smoke, trailing a black arterial fan. The Red Brethren hit around him in the same instant. Terminators met Terminators at arm's length. Chain blades jammed against armor collars and ripped until they found the softer things beneath. Power fists caved in pauldrons and drove broken bones through backplates. A word-bearer champion swung a demon-bound maul at Tyberos's helm. The Shade Lord caught the haft, tore the weapon free with one hand, and punched his chain fist through the traitor's belly. Teeth screamed on spinal column. Black blood geysered over both warriors. Tyberos ripped upward, gutting the legionary from pelvis to sternum, then backhanded the dying torso aside into two mortal attendants, folding all three into the wall. The close fighting there lasted less than a minute and left the battery cloister a butcher's workroom. Severed helms rolled through the smoke. Armored arms lay still, clutching broken blades. Red and grey corpses were tangled together underfoot with the human dead, but the ratio made mockery of the defense. Tyberos moved through it all with monstrous economy, not swift in the mortal sense, but inevitable, a thing too heavily armed and too disciplined to be denied by anything short of artillery or a demigod. One traitor Terminator tried to lock him in place at grappling range, while another drove a chain axe for his neck. Tyberos rammed his lightning claw through the first warrior's visor and out the back of the helm, then used the corpse as a shield against the axe blow before hewing both apart in the same savage arc. Flesh, ceramite, and helm lenses burst into the drifting incense. Outside the breached cloister, the greater war raged without pause. Grey gunships skimmed so low over shrine fields that the heat of their engines peeled banners from towers and set corpse draperies twitching in the wash. Their heavy weapons scythed through cult formations gathered for counterattack, blasting lanes of ruin that filled again moments later as more bodies surged from the rear. Drop pods split open among the trench rivers and disgorged fresh kill squads into the press, their bolters chugging, their blades rising and falling until the trenches around them became layered walls of hacked meat. Then the true strength of the word-bearers struck back. Disciplined bolter lines formed where panic would have been expected. Veteran legionaries stepped through gaps left by shattered cult masses and laid down volleys of exacting fire, not wasting shots on the screaming front ranks, but picking out sergeants, heavy weapon bearers, teleport Homer carriers, and the angles from which the Carcharodons sought to widen their breaches. Possessed shock troops came with them, brethren swollen by the warp, but still held to tactical purpose by dark catechism and iron command. They bounded over the corpses of their own auxiliaries, talons and horned helms slick with ichor, slamming into the flanks of isolated loyalist packs with enough force to crack even Astartes' cohesion for vital seconds. Above, through falling ash lit orange by district fires, came the Ashen Circle. Their jump packs howled like avenging shrines. They descended through the smoke in blackened armor and burning trails, chain glaives in their fists, execution angels of a creed that had long ago stripped all mercy from revelation. They fell upon a Carcharodon assault line advancing through a wrecked pilgrim quarter and turned the rubble alleys into a spinning red charnel. One loyalist lost his head and both shoulders to a single sweeping glaive blow. Another dragged an Ashen Circle killer from the air, broke his spine across a statue plinth, and died a heartbeat later under point-blank plasma from 3 more descending through the ash. On a high command gallery overlooking that quarter, Malak Vol watched the battle unfold and passed judgment on his own faithful. Reports came to him from chained Vox adepts and kneeling Coryphaus in quick succession. The Loyalists had torn the outer batteries at the mountain route. They had taken 3 signal shrines and a relay basilica. A gunship wing had crippled a demon engine march before it reached full deployment. The hunters were doing what they were born to do, cutting out tongues and eyes with predatory precision. Malak did not curse them. He merely adapted the sermon. "Burn the lower tribute districts," he said. The Coryphaus nearest him hesitated only the space of half a breath. "Lord, our own mustering masses hold those streets. Then they shall illuminate them." Orders rolled outward from the gallery. Oil conduits beneath the district floors were opened. Fire servitors dragged ignition chains across hab clusters still crowded with cult levies awaiting deployment. Prometheum reserves meant for armored columns were vented into alleys clogged with civilians and pilgrims pressed into battle labor. A moment later, the entire quarter below blossomed into furnace bloom. Streets became lines of white-orange hellfire. Procession towers sagged. Human masses vanished under flame sheets so fierce that stone itself ran molten in places. The burning served several purposes at once. It denied the Carcharodons cover. It drove fresh panic into the tribute streams and redirected them toward other prepared kill grounds. Most sacred of all, it fed the geometry below the war. Seen from the upper bastions, the new fires completed another arc in the greater sigil being written across the city and the plains beyond. Tens of thousands of Malak's own faithful died, in minutes, not from error, not from desperation, but because their placement within the wider scripture had ended. Far from that gallery, in the half-ruined shell of a captured shrine tower, Takahurangi reached for the inner sanctum through the warp and nearly broke himself upon what answered. He stood amid dead choir thralls and toppled icon stands, while outside the tower the battle boomed and screamed across the plain. His helm had been removed. Frost filmed his face and bled from his eyes. Around him, the surviving members of his warding cadre formed a protective ring, weapons outward, trusting him to do violence of another kind. He let his consciousness descend, past the smoke of the city, past the outer sanctums and shield wards and beacon pits, past the shrines taken by the Loyalists and the shrines sacrificed by the word-bearers alike, deeper inward, where the geometry tightened and the doctrinal pressure grew dense as ocean depth. For an instant he thought he had found only architecture. Then he understood that what he sensed was mind, not sorcerous trickery, not the nested will of covens, not the demon chorus that often clothed such places in false grandeur. Mind, vast as a cathedral chain seen from orbit, old beyond sane measure, layered with memory, revelation, betrayal, grief, conviction, and a species of love so monstrously transfigured by ruin that it had become indistinguishable from apocalypse. The thought touched him only by accident, the way a city might cast shadow across a grave, and even that passing contact drove a spike of agony through both his hearts. He reeled. Blood burst from his nose and mouth. One knee hit the tower floor hard enough to crack stone. A voice moved somewhere beyond hearing, too large to fit into words. Takahurangi ripped himself free before it could notice him fully. The psyker collapsed against the wall, gasping, his hands shaking with the effort of remaining in one piece. A nearby red brother caught him before he struck the floor. "What did you see?" the warrior asked. Takahurangi wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his gauntlet. "A mind older than sanity, a church built out of storms and graves. Do not ask me to stand near it unshielded." Tyberos received the warning without visible reaction and advanced anyway. The sermon fortress they took next stood at the junction of 3 arterial roads and the root of a mountain carved in scripture. Its walls were high and pale, seeming at first to be plaster or sacred stone. Only up close did the truth show fully. They were not stone at all, but layered hides flensed from thousands upon thousands of human bodies, stretched, tanned, cured, and stitched together in colossal panels over iron ribbing. Every seam was sewn with blackened sinew. Every panel bore lines of text in flayed flesh script. The breech charge blew a ragged hole through that living wall and filled the air with a stink like opened graves and wet parchment. Inside, the fortress was a ledger of impending treason. Maps of subsectors and pilgrimage lanes had been inked onto skin draperies hanging from vaulted galleries. Fleet routes were stitched in red thread across great curtain walls. Sacrificial dates, astropathic choir cycles, underhive ignition phrases, names of worlds marked for synchronized apostasy, all hung there in obscene abundance. The Carcharodons moved through chamber after chamber of it, killing the defenders, ripping down the panels, seizing data spines and skin codices for extraction. For all the local victory, the taste of it was wrong. The more they severed, the more the pattern shifted. A signal shrine collapsed under melter charges, and some deeper beacon took up its burden. A relay choir died beneath bolter fire, and another voice opened farther inward. A district burned out, and the geometry merely redirected, as though the world itself were absorbing the cuts and flexing around them. They were destroying vital organs? Yes, yet the beast beneath Sicarus still thought with a deeper brain.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Takahurangi felt it in every afterpulse of the warp. "We are cutting tentacles," he voxed quietly to Tyberos, while the fortress still smoldered around them. The thing beneath withdraws and remembers. Tyberos stood before one of the vast skin maps, black blood drying across his gauntlets. Then we cut deeper. He led the next push across the ash plains toward an ascending line of half-buried sanctums that guarded one of the routes inward. Carcharodon assault companies advanced through trenches so packed with dead that their boots no longer struck earth, but layers of flesh. Around them, billions still fought and died without any single mortal grasp of the whole war. Cultist waves shattered against gun lines and rose again. Demon engines burned in broken husks or strode on through shellfire. Gunships dueled with flak towers whose gunners were nailed to their own emplacements for courage. Everywhere the sky was full of ash, torn banners, spent brass, and the drifting embers of districts Malak had sacrificed for geometry. Then it happened. No warning rune flashed. No psychic scream preceded it. No lightning split the cloud banks. A line was spoken from the sky, not shouted, merely spoken, in a voice so immense that the air itself seemed to bow under it. The words were in Old Colchizian, yet every warrior who heard them understood enough to die by them. An entire Carcharodon assault company froze mid-advance. One moment they were climbing the corpse-choked slope beneath the sanctum walls, bolters barking, formation locked despite the shell fire and the screaming masses below. The next they stopped, as though seized by invisible chains. Not staggered, not slowed, stopped. Grey giants locked in motion, weapons half raised, one boot still lifted toward the next stride. Then the blood inside their sealed armor began to boil. The first signs were the muffled grunts over the squad vox. Then came the wet hammering, the convulsions, the sudden red steam fogging helm lenses from within. One warrior dropped his bolter and clawed at his gorget seals with gauntlets that no longer obeyed him. Another went to one knee, then both, his armor joints hissing as superheated blood jetted from the interfaces. A third simply burst at the neck and wrists, scarlet vapor blasting from every seam as his organs cooked inside the ceramite shell. Across the slope, more and more of them locked where they stood, mute and rigid under that one line from the heavens. Even Tyberos stopped for the smallest fraction of a heartbeat and looked upward into the burning ash dark, toward the place where no face could be seen. Above the battlefield, unseen behind storm and scripture, Lorgar had spoken. The slope beneath the sanctum walls became a place where transhuman flesh learned the heat of mortality from within. Grey armored giants who had crossed void gulfs and fed worlds to silence stood locked in seizure beneath the spoken weight of a Primarch's will. Their blood boiled inside sealed plate. Their organs burst in their chests. Their vox channels filled with grunts forced through clenched teeth, then with the wet hammering of bodies cooking alive inside ceramite. One brother toppled backward and split at the gorget as red steam blasted from the seams of his warplate. Another remained kneeling with both gauntlets buried in the mud of the corpse slope, his helm bowed, black smoke rising from the mouth grill as his hearts failed one after the other. The word-bearers did not cheer. They advanced. That was the first truth of the counter-hunt. The foe did not fling itself into fury. It did not abandon measure for ecstasy. The hosts of Sicarus moved with liturgical timing, as if every advance had already been rehearsed in prayer. Bolter lines rose from trench mouths the instant the stricken Carcharodons faltered. Mortar. Choirs hidden within collapsed shrine crypts began firing in metered sequence, not for massacre alone, but to drive the loyalists into prearranged channels between burning districts. Vox towers that should have been dead awoke again in voices stolen from slaughtered brethren, issuing false bearing corrections and retreat vectors that led only deeper into prepared kill grounds. The air itself betrayed. Hymns whispered from the smoke in tones that mimicked squad leaders. Target runes ghosted across helm displays, then inverted. Auspex returns began to show walls where there were none, empty roads where trenches waited, silence where demonic engine convoys were already grinding into position. Tyberos dragged one boiling warrior from the line and cut his throat through the neck seals before the mutation could complete. He did it without pause and without ceremony. The brother's body had already begun to swell under the armor, meat growing in unsanctioned directions as the Primarch's phrase curdled in his blood. There would be no recovery from that, no evacuation, no chance granted to corruption, simply because the soul inside the plate had once fought well and faithfully. Tyberos drove a claw through the helm and out the back in one clean thrust, then shoved the corpse aside and signaled advance. Two more fell before the company cleared the slope. Takahurangi felt the change all around them, as keenly as a knife against scar tissue. Sicarus was no longer reacting to pain. It was pursuing. The world had tasted the hunters, and now turned its whole diseased anatomy toward them. The roads altered where no engineer had touched them. Corridors in captured bastions lengthened or folded back into themselves. Stairwells descended farther than the structures could physically contain. Doors sealed under skin membranes that pulsed and breathed. Chapel vaults swallowed sound and fed it back wrong, so that every spoken order returned half a second late in a dead man's voice. The kill packs ceased to be hunters moving through fixed terrain. They became prey moving through a mouth that was learning their gait. Tyberos led his surviving point elements into the crypt city beneath the sanctum line, where mausoleum towers descended instead of rising, buried mile upon mile below the ash plains in stacked sepulchral districts. There the walls were made not of stone, but of lacquered bone and funerary iron. Niches held saints that twitched when no one looked straight at them. Reliquary arches flexed inward like throats swallowing. Hallways lined in flensed skin, narrowed by increments too small for mortal sight, but plain to Astartes' senses, squeezing their formations apart and forcing them into serial advance. The word-bearers had prepared it all. Ambush liturgies were keyed to footfall, mass, and spoken response. When one Carcharodon squad passed beneath a vault of chained censers, the bronze bells above them began tolling a catechism of inversion. Hidden murder slits opened behind panels of devotional hide, and disciplined bolter fire raked the column from both sides at once, driving mass reactive shells through joints, eye lenses, and weapon housings. The defenders fell back before counterfire could properly answer them, vanishing into side cloisters already filling with lesser bodies, driven forward by whip choirs and sermon servitors. Every sacrifice was timed. Cultist floods came not as useless meat thrown away in blind zeal, but as pressure waves released to slow the hunters exactly when artillery, ambush packs, or demon engines required breathing room to deploy. Whole populations were being spent like ammunition. Malach Vol preached from moving pulpits borne atop tracked altar platforms, his voice amplified across trench fields and crypt entrances alike, keeping the billions in ordered religious motion. When one kill zone emptied, another processional stream was redirected into it. When a district burned too, hot for infantry advance, he ordered breeding pitstock herded through the lower tunnels to emerge in the loyalists' rear. Behind those waves came veteran hosts in crimson plate, every step anchored in doctrine, every retreat false, every weakness bait. Above the crypt city strode enslaved god engines, not full battle titans in the ancient and proper sense, for even the word-bearers husbanded such relics jealously, but warped and shackled support engines dragged into debased service. Their silhouettes loomed over the ash fog like cathedrals taught to walk. One bore a chapel where a head should have been, its bells tolling between plasma fusillades. Another dragged chain-borne reliquaries behind it and fired siege shells from a gun barrel shaped like a screaming saint. Their footfalls shook dust from mausoleum ceilings. Their reactor chants bled through the floors and into the bones of the city below. The Carcharodons suffered for every meter taken. Ammunition became a prayer of diminishing returns. Bolter magazines ran dry at the worst instance and were refilled from the belts and pouches of the dead, loyalist and traitor alike. Chain teeth clogged with bone and skin, forcing warriors to kick clear bodies from hallways just to make room for emergency maintenance in the lull between ambushes. Teleport homers failed as ritual interference thickened. Reinforcement runes blinked false green, then vanished entirely. Vox discipline frayed under the constant background noise of Sicarus, where whispers nested in static and command codes returned mangled through layers of warping echo. A red brother reported a clean route east and led his kill pack directly into a skin vault, whose floor liquefied into grasping tendons the moment enough armored mass stood upon it. They died hard there, firing down into the red mire, while possessed things climbed from the walls on hooked limbs. But they died cut off and unheard, their final vox bursts arriving across the net as if spoken from underwater. Tyberos changed nothing in his expression, because there was nothing to change. He simply made the line harsher. Any brother showing signs of psychic compromise, biological inversion, or trackable capture risk was to be terminated without appeal. No wounded were left for recovery if recovery threatened the mission. Gene seed was retrieved where possible. Where impossible, the remains were atomized or burned. One veteran of the Red Brethren took a warp splinter through the chest in a collapsed reliquary hall and began laughing in a voice not his own, while his secondary heart grew spurs along the wound channel. He looked up at Tyberos through cracked lenses and tried to speak some plea or oath. Tyberos decapitated him before the words formed. "Forward," he said. Only that. The cruelty of it was not born from malice. It was born from function sharpened until it resembled pitilessness. No word-bearer would take one of his. No demon would ride loyalist. Flesh deeper into the line. Mercy was too expensive for the place they had entered. Takahurangi found the truth of the ritual in a chamber made from throats. He had broken away with a small guard to pursue the source of a recurring harmonic buried beneath the Vox corruption. It led him through descending vaults where the walls were lined with preserved larynxes, each mounted in brass fittings, each still flexing around whispering air. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. They pulsed when he passed, vibrating in answer to some larger resonance deeper below. At the chamber's center rose a lattice of iron pylons linked by skin cables, soul batteries, pain conductors, and astropathic resonators, bound together in such a way that only a mind steeped in doctrinal cruelty could have conceived it. He understood then that the deaths they had seen were merely input. The shrines, the beacon worlds, the processional massacres, the cities put to the torch, the choir towers ruptured, the billions chanting words they did not remember learning, all of it fed this, a living gospel engine. A lattice of belief, pain, and synchronized speech meant not merely to glorify Lorgar's return to action, but to transmit his revelation across the great rift itself. Not by fleet alone, not by astropathic signal in the crude strategic sense, by spiritual ignition, by spoken contagion, a phrase seeded through shrines and pulpits, through cult cells and choir pits, through underhive congregations and void pilgrim routes, until a Primarch's voice moved across light years in the minds of the faithful and the weak. Takahurangi swayed as the scale of it settled upon him. This was not a war plan. It was a weapon aimed at civilization itself. He voxed Tyberos at once, every word clipped by pain. The apostle is not enough. Hear me. The apostle is not enough. He is building a mouth for the Primarch, a living engine of revelation. If it speaks in fullness, whole sectors will answer before a fleet can fire a shot. Tyberos's reply came through static and distant gunfire. Can it be broken? Yes. A shell impact boomed somewhere near the Sicarus position. Dust and wet fragments pattered over the Vox. How? Sever enough nodes and the transmission will cripple. Not end. Cripple. The engine has arteries, shrines, relays, choir pits. It must remain synchronized. If we cut inward and wide at once, we may force it to stammer. There was a pause, brief as a blade turning in a wound. Do it. It was the impossible option, and so it became the chosen one. The decapitation strike would not cease. Tyberos would continue to drive toward the inner cathedral and the guiding clergy who composed the sermon in real time. At the same hour, the remaining dispersed packs were ordered to collapse whatever ritual nodes they could reach, even at total attrition, even if the kill packs vanished one by one in the dark. The hunt became two wars fought, with the same dwindling claws, one against the mouths, one against the lungs. Malak Vol welcomed the adjustment. He had expected no less. From the high chancel of a moving war altar that crawled above the crypt city on chains and pistons, He continued his sermons while the counter-offensive matured around the Loyalists. Gal Vorbak packs were committed at the exact hours when the enemy would be most reduced, after long fighting and low ammunition, not before. Demon packs were loosed into the undervaults by liturgical cue, their pathing bound to bells rung from towers already sighted by hidden artillery. Titan support was instructed not to seek annihilation, but pressure, driving the Carcharodons towards sectors whose geometry best fed the lower engine. He was not merely repelling an invasion, he was writing with it. A captured word-bearer chaplain confirmed as much. The Carcharodon pack that took him found him pinned beneath the wreckage of a split reliquary column, both legs, crushed, Crozius gone, one lung punctured. He was helmless, his face scarred by old devotion and fresh stone cuts, yet his smile remained infuriatingly serene, even while Tyberos' boot rested on his chest. "Speak," said the Shade Lord. The chaplain laughed blood into his own beard. Tyberos tore away one arm at the shoulder. The laughter worsened. "You still think you choose your path," the word-bearer gasped. "You think you break shrines and towers and somehow force the shape of this war. You are inside the sermon, Void Shark. Every cut you make is already written." Tyberos leaned closer, helm lenses cold above the dying priest. "Where?" The chaplain coughed. Fragments of rib and clot came with it. "The Primarch has already composed the cadence of your hunger, your descent, your slaughter, your dead. Every step of this hunt is entering the litany even now." Tyberos removed the other arm. The chaplain sagged, but did not lose that wretched joy. "Where?" Tyberos repeated. The answer came not as location alone, but as worship. In the inner cathedral, in the sanctum under the burning scripture, where the voice waits for its lungs. Tyberos left him alive for another few seconds, only so Tekahurangi could touch the chaplain's brow and strip the final scrap of navigational truth from his failing mind. Then, the Shade Lord crushed the traitor's throat under his heel and ordered movement. They reached the approach to the inner cathedral through a district of skin vaults and black archivums, moving amid walls that sweated old blood and floors engraved with names of worlds not yet fallen. Resistance thickened as expected. Word-bearer veterans struck and withdrew. Ashen circle remnants dropped from upper galleries in lines of fire. Possessed architecture joined the war in earnest. Doorways grew teeth. Pillars split to reveal flensed torsos wired into artillery housings. Corridors lengthened and bent until forward. Progress became a running duel with the world's own refusal to yield. Then, abruptly, the resistance fell away. No gunfire met them in the final approach hall. No cult masses surged from side vaults. No hidden emplacements opened. Only silence and the wet crackle of distant flame. Tyberos advanced at the head of his remaining guard, chain fist low, claws flexing once. Tekahurangi moved beside him, despite the blood drying black around his nose and eyes. Their boots echoed through the long nave corridor, past cracked St. Niches and censers swinging without visible chains. At the end of that corridor stood a gate of flensed bronze and stitched hide. It was closed when they first saw it. Before they had taken 10 more steps, lines began to appear upon the walls to either side. Fresh blood welled from the skin panels in narrow strokes. Black fire followed those strokes, cauterizing them into script that burned without consuming the flesh beneath. The writing spread in perfect Colchizian, vast and elegant, each character forming as if an invisible stylus moved ahead of them just beyond sight. The heat of it rolled down the corridor. The smell was copper, ash, and old parchment. Tekahurangi stopped dead. Tyberos did not. The final line formed at eye level before the gate, letters running with blood, their edges limned in black flame. It was not a warning. It was an invitation. Tyberos, it read. Come to the inner cathedral. Lorgar awaits. The gate to the inner cathedral did not open. It yielded. The great leaves of flensed bronze and stitched hide bowed inward without sound, not on hinges, but as though some immense pressure beyond them had withdrawn its hand and allowed the material world a temporary breath. Black fire ran along the seams and curled back into the walls. Heat bled from the threshold in long exhalations, carrying with it the stench of incense, blood, hot iron, molten brass, and the sweet rot of countless opened bodies sanctified too, slowly. Tyberos crossed first. His surviving red brethren followed in a wedge of scarred plate and dried gore, their weapons low, their ammunition diminished, their silence harder than any oath. Takahurangi came among them, with his stave clenched in one gauntlet, and his face hidden once more behind his helm, though the seals around the lenses had been darkened by blood from within. None among them spoke. Words belonged to the enemy in this place. The hunters carried only motion and the promise of it. The cathedral beyond was too large for the language of architecture. Its floor spread away in terraces of black stone, cut with lines of old Colchizian script, broad enough to swallow Hab blocks whole. Kilometre-high lecterns rose from the nave like siege towers grown from scripture itself, each one piled with books bound in skin, brass-plated codices chained by the thousand, and slabs of wet parchment still being inked by hanging scribes whose lower halves had long ago fused into the writing desks that consumed them. Suspended above the processional avenue drifted saints fashioned from fused human bodies, entire congregations welded into single gigantic devotional forms, their many arms outstretched in endless benediction, their faces frozen in 1,000 stages of ecstasy, agony, revelation, and death. From the vaulted heights swung censers the size of warships, their chains vanishing into the smoke dark beyond sight, each titanic vessel bleeding molten brass through rents in their sides, so that glowing metal streamed down in viscous curtains and pooled along channels cut into the floor. The choirs were worse. They were not arranged in lofts or galleries in the old human manner. They hung in tiers along the walls, rank upon rank of mutilated men, bound upright in bronze harnesses, their ribs split and spread, their lungs cut open into petaled cavities, through which the air was forced by hidden engines. Every note they sang was accompanied by a spray of red vapor. Every cadence was a drowning. Their voices joined and climbed and folded over one another until the entire cathedral trembled with the massed misery of song. It was not beautiful. It was too exact for beauty. It was doctrine made audible through the mechanical abuse of flesh. Even the red brethren slowed, not from fear, from the primal revulsion of living warriors entering a place so fully given over to theology that it had ceased to resemble any species of battlefield they had been born to master. This was not a fortress. It was a throat. At the far end of the impossible nave, where processional stairs climbed toward a black altar platform, broad as a fortress wall, stood Malak Fol. He had removed his helm. His face was carved by old scripture brands and webbed with pale scar tissue where ritual cuts had long ago become permanent lines of office. Black blood had dried along one cheek. His eyes were fever bright, but his expression held no frenzy. He stood like a priest, at the climax of a service he had prepared all his life to conduct. Around him, in ordered half-circles, stood the survivors of his chosen host, dark apostles, Corifhaus, red-armored veterans, ashen circle killers blackened by descent through fire, Gal Vorbak crouched like breathing tumors in chains of brass and scripture. None moved to attack yet. Their weapons were ready. Their silence was permission enough. Malak spread his arms as Tyberos and the Carcharodons advanced into the center of the nave. "You have done as you were meant to do," he said, and his voice carried without effort, borne upon the cathedral's own monstrous acoustics. "You have severed worthy arteries. You have slain the hesitant, burned the obsolete, and driven this world to reveal its truer layers. I thank you." Tyberos did not answer. Malak smiled faintly. "Did you imagine I mourned the districts I put to the torch? The breeding rivers redirected into flame? The lesser congregations sent into your guns? Did you think proximity to truth would leave me clinging to inventory like an administratum clerk? His gaze moved over the dead and dying carried in memory upon the Carcharodon's armor, over the blood-slick claws of the Shade Lord, over Tekahurangi's war-scarred helm. I fed them all into the grinder willingly, my legion, my slaves, my hosts, my cities. Their deaths matter only in relation to him. To stand near his purpose is worth more than 10,000 worlds of undirected life. To hear one unfinished thought from him is worth the extinction of empires. What is a district? What is a million lives? What is a legionary? Ash and ink, fuel and punctuation. One of the suspended choir saints above the nave twitched. The song changed key. Malak lowered his arms, and his expression hardened into something both reverent and murderous. You have crossed hell to bring your corpse God's silence into this house. Now you will see what silence has birthed against you. The pressure came before the form. It descended through the cathedral like a greater gravity entering lesser space. The molten brass pouring from the censers bent inward midstream. The choirs stuttered and then redoubled their notes in perfect submission. Every word-bearer in the nave went to one knee as one body, veteran killers bowing until their helms nearly touched the scripture-cut floor. Even Malak lowered his head. The Gal Vorbak flattened themselves like beasts before a storm. Only the Carcharodons remained standing. The light at the altar deepened into a dark radiance, if such a contradiction could exist. Not brightness, but significance. The eye was drawn there not because of illumination, but because reality itself had accepted a hierarchy and placed all lesser things below the being now stepping into view. Lorgar Aurelian descended the altar steps with calm enough to shame all violence. He was vast, yes, towering above any Astartes, but he was not the slavering parody of demonhood weak minds like to imagine when speaking of fallen primarchs. He was robed in scripture and dark majesty, his armor a baroque work of blackened gold, bronze, crimson, and runic fire, every plate carrying lines of truth stolen from ages no loyalist tongue should remember. Horns crowned him, yet did not reduce him to beast. Their curve only framed the impossible nobility of a face made terrible by certainty rather than rage. His skin was pale where it showed, though touched with a twilight cast, and his eyes held depths of old hurt, old conviction, and old contempt layered so densely that to meet them was to glimpse civilizations dying inside a single unblinking judgment. He came on with no weapon raised. He had no need. A red brother fired first. It was no failure of discipline. It was the only sane answer to the presence before them. The bolt left the muzzle in a tongue of fire. It stopped in the air halfway to Lorgar and remained there, spinning, gently, its mass reactive core ticking in impotent denial of its own nature. The Primarch did not even turn his head toward the warrior who had fired. "Your fear," he said, "has always worn the mask of duty." The Red Brother's chest detonated inward, not outward as with a shell impact, but inward, as if some invisible giant hand had closed around his twin hearts and crushed them into nothing between one beat and the next. He fell without a cry, armor clanging against the black floor, blood pumping from his mouth grill in dark bursts. Lorgar continued walking. Another Carcharodon fired, then 3 more. A volley of bolts shrieked through the incense-thick air. They halted before him in a glittering crescent of captured wrath. He spoke a line in Old Colchizian, a phrase soft enough that it might have been instruction rather than command. The stopped bolts turned as one and drove sideways into the choir walls, ripping mutilated singers apart in wet explosions that only made the music harsher. Tekahurangi flinched, feeling the words as force. Lorgar lifted one hand and recited from memory, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the unhurried authority of a teacher correcting errors in an inferior script. The verse left his lips and became pressure. Invisible weight hammered the Carcharodons, flattening the front rank, driving Terminator plate into the floor hard enough to crack stone and snap old bones beneath. One warrior's pauldrons imploded inward, crushing the flesh under them to slurry. Another lost an arm at the socket as the limb simply tore free, armor and tendon parting together under a telekinetic convulsion born from spoken theology. "Do you think this is war?" Lorgar asked, his voice cold as a burial chamber. "You have mistaken the surface of events for their meaning. You have mistaken butchery for interruption. You have crossed the threshold of a sentence you do not possess the scale to read," Tyberos answered by charging. By no challenge, no curse, no declaration of loyalty, no rhetoric to meet revelation. He simply became motion, hurling his vast armored bulk down the nave in a suicidal spear of iron hatred. The Red Brethren followed at once, not because any hope of measured victory remained, but because they had been born for the kill and would not stand at sermon while an enemy breathed. The sheer savagery of it shocked the cathedral. Grey Terminators thundered through script and molten brass. One shouldered into a kneeling word-bearer veteran and crushed him flat without slowing. Another chain-fisted a Gal Vorbak across the face and ripped away half the abomination's skull in a fountain of black gore. Bolter fire filled the nave again, not as disciplined volley, but as closing-range execution. The word-bearer honor line rose to intercept and vanished into the impact. Tyberos hit Malak Fol's nearest bodyguards first. His chain fist tore through a Coryphaus from clavicle to hip, chewing plate, organs, and spine into smoking ruin. His lightning claw opened another from helm brow to groin in one descending arc, the two halves spinning apart through the incense like butchered offerings. He plowed onward over the tumbling dead, black blood and red blood mixing beneath his boots until the scripture channels ran with both. Malak met him with his Crozius and lost. The Dark Apostle swung with righteous fury, the demon caged in his weapon screaming as it came down toward Tyberos's helm. The Shade Lord caught the blow on one armored forearm, let the impact ring through his frame, then rammed his claw through Malak's side and out his back. Black blood sprayed over the altar stair. Malak snarled, spat scripture into Tyberos's faceplate, and struck again with the Crozius head, cracking one lens. Tyberos answered by ripping sideways. Ceramite, organs, and relic chains burst apart. Malak was thrown clear, not dead, but ruined, crashing hard against the lower altar stones with one side of his torso hanging open to the ribs. The Red Brethren died around their lord in appalling numbers. Lorgar had not moved far, yet every step of the assault cost lives. One Terminator raised his Stormbolter and found himself seized in mid-stride by invisible force. His armor compressed with a series of shrieks and crunches until blood burst from every seam and the shell collapsed around a pulped core. Another reached striking range with chain-blade roaring and was simply cut in half by a rent, in reality opened beneath him when Lorgar recited another verse. The air split lengthwise in burning black. Warp light poured from the wound. The warrior vanished from waist upward into that impossible seam, while the lower half of him crashed to the floor, still taking one last reflexive step. Takahurangi drove himself beyond all sane reserve. He planted his stave and sent his mind against the Primarch's sight, not to overcome it, which would have been delusion, but to stain it, to cloud a single angle, to force a moment's blindness where absolute perception had stood. The attempt burned through him like white metal. Memories peeled away. He felt names he had carried for centuries go dim. Faces vanished forever from his inner vault. Campaigns, stars, old deaths, old victories, all of it flared and burned as fuel for that one impossible effort. For a heartbeat, Lorgar's head turned. For a heartbeat, the pressure around Tyberos lessened. The Shade Lord took the chance and reached the Primarch. His chain fist came first, not for flesh, but for the warding reliquary hanging at Lorgar's breast, a black gold icon shaped like a burning tome, set with an eye that wept crimson light. The teeth struck with a scream of metal and scripture. Wards burst in a spray of black fire. The relic shattered, fragments scything outward into kneeling word-bearers and suspended choirs alike. Tyberos's other claw raked across Lorgar's side a fraction later, cutting through the edge of the Primarch's cuirass and opening flesh beneath. Black blood smoked on the air. It fell in slow drops and hissed where it struck the script-carved floor. For the first time in the battle, a true change touched the cathedral. Word-bearers cried out in horror. Malak, half flayed and drowning in his own blood, tried to crawl upright in ecstasy and disbelief both. Even the choirs broke rhythm for a heartbeat as the scent of Primarch blood entered the chamber. Lorgar looked down at the wound with an expression less like pain than recognition. Then his gaze returned to Tyberos. "There," he said softly. "That is why you were invited." The words carried more weight than any blow. Tyberos tried to strike again. Invisible force seized his right arm and hurled him sideways through a lectern the size of a bunker wall. Stone, skin-bound tomes, and burning manuscript chains exploded outward. 3 red brethren died with him beneath the collapsing ruin. Another staggered up from the debris, only to have his helm ripped free by telekinetic force so sudden that most of his skull came with it. Lorgar stepped down one more stair, black blood trailing along the edge of his armor. "I did not summon you because you could kill me," he said. "I summoned you because your death upon this stage would speak. The loyal predator, the executioner of the void, the silent beast of a dying empire brought into the sanctum and broken before revelation. Such a death does not end with the body. It becomes scripture. It infects memory. It haunts the future." He turned his eyes briefly toward Tekahurangi, who was on one knee now, blood pouring from nose, ears, and one ruined lens, his mind scorched and patchworked by the effort of those stolen seconds. "And even your resistance serves. Pain lends edge to the word. Defiance gives it shape." Malakfol laughed then, a wet, ruined sound from the altar steps. He pressed one hand against the gaping ruin of his side and smiled with red teeth at the spectacle before him. "Do you see now, hunter?" he croaked. "Even your wound is praise." Tyberos rose from the broken lectern, armor cracked, one claw sparking, one lens dark, black and red blood smeared across him in equal claim. He said nothing. He simply came forward again, because that was all that remained proper to his nature. The floor lurched, not from artillery, not from impact, from beneath. The whole cathedral trembled. Then the terraces cracked in long, jagged lines. Molten brass channels burst upward. The suspended saints above the nave swung wildly on their chains, shedding fused limbs and screaming faces onto the combatants below. From deep under the altar, there came a sound like continents grinding their teeth. Tekahurangi's head snapped up, despite the agony flensing through his thoughts. "The sanctum is not the engine," he rasped. "This was never the engine." Lorgar's expression did not change, yet a darker satisfaction entered his eyes. "The preface," he said. The black floor split open. Through the widening chasm beneath the altar and the lower nave, there surged not magma, but light. Red, gold, script-shaped, whole rivers of living language pouring upward from caverns far below, where something vaster than the cathedral had been hidden beneath all their slaughter. The terraces heaved. Walls cracked from foundation to vault. Across the whole breadth of Sicarus, far beyond the sanctum, answering quakes began to roll. The world was opening. Sicarus broke like a skull beneath a sanctified hammer. The first fractures that had opened beneath the inner cathedral became continental wounds in the span of heartbeats. What had begun as a shudder under the black script, cut floor, surged outward through the demon world in widening rings of sacrilege and collapse. Mountain ranges inscribed with scripture split down the center of their own colossal letters. Cathedral chains snapped, with sounds like battleship broadsides, and the inverted cities hanging beneath the bruised cloud mantle sheared free of their impossible anchor points and plunged downward in slow majesty toward the burning abyss below. Flesh hills burst open, vomiting processions of half-formed bodies and black steam. Fortress monasteries toppled from their ridgelines and vanished into widening red-gold chasms where the hidden engine beneath the world now bled its revelation into the air. Across the plains and urban districts of Sicarus, entire hive cities of worshippers died at once. Districts collapsed as if the ground had withdrawn permission for them to exist. Hab towers filled with chanting millions sank straight down into incandescent pits, their lower floors vanishing first, their upper tiers tipping and grinding together as packed populations cascaded through broken levels in avalanches of flesh and masonry. Processional roads buckled and folded into themselves, dumping endless lines of tribute bearers into the fire beneath. Trench networks became graves so broad that their own defenders and attackers tumbled in together, grey armor, crimson plate, demon things, cult masses, war engines, banners, and artillery trains, all swallowed by the same opening jaws of the earth. The dying did not fall in silence. Their screams rose into the choir storm above and became fuel. In orbit, the sky had ceased to resemble a battlefield and taken on the aspect of a scripture being burned page by rival gods. Grey warships and crimson heretic cruisers tore at one another across the upper reaches, framed against the bleeding wound glow of the world below. Macro ordnance crossed the void in lines of white annihilation, punching through shields and armor alike, opening entire decks to vacuum and fire. Boarding torpedoes slammed into wounded hulls, while gun batteries still raked their flanks, turning every crippled vessel into a contested cathedral of decompression, ruptured. Plasma conduits and chain-blade work in darkness. Demonic breaches yawned without warning along ruptured keels, vomiting clawed things into engine sanctums and bridge galleries, where crew were butchered by the thousand before emergency bulkheads could seal. One battle barge of the Carcharodons lost half its port batteries when a pilgrim ark packed with corpse-bound explosives and chanting fanatics rammed its flank beneath the void shield flare. The impact opened a wound the size of a city block. Tens of thousands of serfs, armsmen, adepts, and work gangs died in the explosive decompression, their bodies flashing from the breach in a frozen torrent of blood, metal, parchment, and shrine wreckage. Another strike cruiser, already grappling with a word-bearer's vessel in a boarding lock so close the hulls screamed together, suffered an internal reality breach in its lower reliquary deck. The deck folded inside out. A whole company of mortal attendants died with their bones outside their flesh. The surviving Carcharodon defenders sealed the compartment and vented it hard, freezing the demonic spill and the dead alike against the inner hull before melter teams burned the whole section out of the ship. The sky above Sicarus had become a place where millions died by the minute, and no one had leisure to mourn them. Below, in the collapsing inner cathedral, Tyberos looked once more toward Lorgar and chose against his own blood. It was not mercy that turned him. It was not fear. It was the cold, brutal arithmetic that separated a hunter from a berserker. The Primarch was there, black blood still smoking where the claw had opened him, wrath gathering about him now in waves of fire and impossible pressure. Every instinct bred into Tyberos's marrow demanded he hurl himself once more at that vast and wounded target until one of them ceased. Yet take Ahurangi's warning, half drowned in the crack of breaking stone and the shriek of the choir saints falling from their chains, bit harder than instinct. "The core is below," the psyker voxed, his voice ragged with blood loss and burned memory. "Kill him later. Break the mouth now." Tyberos turned from Lorgar. Word-bearers cried out in disbelief and fury. Some thought it retreat and rushed forward to capitalize. Others, wiser, saw the true shape of the move and tried to interpose themselves between the Carcharodons and the widening chasm beneath the altar. Tyberos did not grant them formation. He signaled the last drive with a cut of his claw, and his remaining warriors plunged down through collapsing stairways, shattered lecterns, and terraces pitching into the growing abyss, not toward the Primarch's body, but toward the hidden gospel engine, vomiting red script light from the world's broken bowels. Malak Vol dragged himself upright from the altar steps and became the final mortal wall between them and the descent. He should have been dying already. One side of his torso was open to the ribs. Black blood drenched his war plate in sheets. Relic chains hung loose from broken mounts. Yet whatever demon-blessed durability or Primarch proximity had filled him, it had not finished with him yet. He jammed the shattered lower shaft of his Crozius back into its screaming demon head and rose amid the falling brass, the splitting floor, and the slaughter of his own bodyguards, like a priest refusing burial. "You will not profane it with silence," he snarled. Then he charged Tyberos through a rain of broken choir bodies and molten metal. The collision was brutal enough to make the cracked altar stair collapse under both their weights. Malak's Crozius came down in a two-handed arc and struck Tyberos across the shoulder and upper chest. The blow cracked Terminator plate with a sound like splitting armor glass, drove the Shade Lord half a step sideways, and sent fragments of grey ceramite spinning through the incense haze. Tyberos answered with the chain fist, roaring for Malak's center mass. The Dark Apostle twisted in close, letting the teeth bite into his already ruined side instead of his spine, and hammered the Crozius head into Tyberos's helm. One lens shattered fully. Broken teeth from Malak's own mouth flew between them in black blood and saliva. They locked at grappling range. No clean dueling forms, no measured exchange of noble champions. Only two armored killers chest to chest, boot to boot, trying to force murder through whatever seam opened first. Malak spat scripture into Tyberos's face grill and drove a combat blade up under the breastplate crack his Crozius had made. The blade went into the hilt. Tyberos responded by closing one claw around Malak's throat and squeezing until vertebrae ground against each other audibly. The Dark Apostle struck again and again with the Crozius, each blow cracking another line into the Terminator plate, each impact driving both of them deeper into the collapsing rubble at the chasm edge. A Red Brother tried to intervene and died when a Gal Vorbak pounced from above and tore his head and left arm free in the same motion. Another Carcharodon chain-fisted the abomination through the back before it could feed. Around the duel, the whole sanctum had become a writhing ring of close slaughter, surviving word-bearers and Carcharodons hacking at one another on tilting masonry, while the abyss beneath breathed up light and heat and script in equal measure. Malak drove the demon head of the Crozius into Tyberos's chest one final time and felt the plate give. That fraction of triumph lasted no longer than a pulse. Tyberos rammed his lightning claw through the Dark Apostle's lower face. The talons entered through jaw and palate and punched out behind the skull in a spray of black blood, broken teeth, and bone shards. Malak convulsed on the blades, eyes rolling, one hand still clawing for Tyberos's throat. The Shade Lord tore upward, the Apostle's gorget split. His neck opened. Half his face peeled away into the incense clouds. Still, he did not die quickly enough. Some demon perseverance, some final hysterical refusal of the flesh to relinquish proximity to the holy, kept him twitching and choking. Tyberos dropped the chain fist, seized Malak by the ruined torso with both hands, and tore him apart. Ceramite popped, ligaments snapped, organs slid free in steaming ropes. The upper half came away with one arm, and part of the spine still attached. The lower half toppled backward and kicked at the edge of the abyss before vanishing into the red light below. Tyberos hurled the remaining portion aside into a knot of advancing word-bearers, hard enough to crush two of them flat beneath the corpse. The death of Malak Fol changed the cathedral, not by morale alone, though plenty of lesser cultists and slaves died screaming at the sight. It changed in current and alignment. The blood of a Dark Apostle so near the center of the rite mattered. His relics mattered. The Crozius mattered. The scripture carved into his own flesh mattered. Takahurangi saw it at once and acted while he still possessed enough of his mind to know urgency. He and the surviving librarians descended upon the apostles' remains as warriors around them fought and died. One ripped the Crozius head free and slammed it into a broken ward socket along the chasm edge. Another took Malak's blood in both gauntlets and smeared it across the nearest script runes in patterns of inversion drawn from the stolen codices taken in the earlier raids. Takahurangi himself knelt amid broken teeth and smoking black gore, reciting the old Colchisian countersigns backward through a mouth that barely obeyed him. He laid the apostle's severed hand upon a blood channel and forced its relic rings into new alignments, bridging heresy with anti-heresy, using the priest's own consecrated ruin against the engine he had served. For a few precious moments, it worked. The red script. Light surging from below stuttered. Whole columns of text rising from the abyss reversed direction and drove back downward. Choirs burst in unison as the harmonics twisted. Suspended saints tore free of their chains and crashed into the nave. Beneath the altar, deeper than any of them had yet seen, something huge and ordered flashed into partial visibility. The core. It was not a machine in the mortal sense. It was a cavity miles wide lined with pylons, corpse furnaces, choir lattices, astropathic resonators, soul pressure engines, and living veins of scripture carved directly into the planetary bone. A transmission focus hung at its center like a black sun wrapped in pages of burning light, fed by millions of channels, everyone carrying pain, faith, and synchronized speech upward into the cathedral throat above. Tyberos saw what needed killing and did not hesitate. "Break it," he voxed. The Carcharodons descended, not with grace, not with noble sacrifice. They did not leap, like heroes, into some clean light of redemption. They slid, dropped, crashed, and fought their way down the collapsing sanctum foundations into the gospel engine's exposed innards, overloading what they could reach with the tools of professional annihilation. Captive reactors were cut from their mountings and driven into overload by combat blades rammed into their control cores. Corpse furnaces were jammed with bodies, sacred oils, spent munitions, and broken gear until their demon-fed burners choked and burst. Demon-bound pylons were wired together with torn power cables and then fed with inverted catechisms until the entities in their cages tore the housings apart from within. The entire complex became a collapsing wound, not surgically excised, but beaten into catastrophic failure by warriors too spent and too practical for elegance. Above them, Lorgar's patience ended. He descended through the ruin, not with haste, but with wrath so total it gave speed a different meaning. Fire walked behind him. Demons poured from rents opening in his wake. The pressure of his presence drove rubble outward and crushed the dying into the floors. Word-bearers near him shouted praise and then burst apart as the overspill of his unleashed will struck them harder than enemy fire. He recited no measured corrections now. He thundered revelation. Each phrase tore new fissures in reality. Each gesture dragged black flame across stone and flesh alike. His wound smoked darker now, the black blood along his side a burning script of its own. Tyberos reached the transmission focus as the first true collapse began. It hung above a shaft of red-gold storm, wrapped in sheets of language and held in place by chains of light anchored to the world's opened core. Around it circled the harvested remains of 1,000 choirs, their voices no longer distinct from the machine, but bound into it as one unending intake of agony. Even damaged, even stuttering, it was beautiful in the way. Execution devices are beautiful to those who build them for faith. Takahurangi's voice found him through the roaring. The center, the black heart, destroy the focus, or all this buys nothing. Tyberos climbed the last broken gantry and threw himself at it. The first stroke of the chain fist tore through one of the light chains and made the whole engine scream. Not metaphorically. The sound came from every surface at once. The second strike bit into the outer shell of the focus and split it open in a blast of script fragments and soul fire. The third strike, delivered with both hands locked on the weapon housing and all the monstrous strength left in his frame, punched into the heart of the thing and ripped downward through whatever impossible organs were nested there. The transmission focus died. Its death was not merciful. The bound voices inside it did not fade. They detonated outward in a wave of revelation turned inside out. Across Sicarus, every choir pit, shrine, node, processional route, and beacon world linked into the engine convulsed in answer. Billions who had been feeding it by prayer, fear, or simple proximity were consumed by the backlash. Hive districts folded into red dust. Pilgrim masses ignited from within. Astropathic pits burst in vertical pillars of flesh. The very language seeded into the populations of infected sectors beyond flickered and guttered, robbed of its grand synchronizing mouth before it could properly speak. Untold imperial worlds were spared. Untold billions upon Sicarus were damned in their place. The engine core collapsed inward around Tyberos, throwing him clear across a buckling platform and into the ruins of a choir lattice, where dead men still twitched in their bronze frames. All around him, the gospel engine came apart, pylons toppling, furnaces erupting, the central shaft collapsing into a storm of burning pages and black lightning. Carcharodons were hurled from gantries, crushed under falling scripture, blocks, buried in the very machinery they had broken. The mission was won in the ugliest possible way, which was to say, in the only way it could ever have been won. Then, the Primarch landed. Lorgar came down onto the broken engine platform in a storm of fire, demons, and impossible pressure, his robes and armor trailing scripture flame, his face now stripped of even the cold remnant of patience he had worn in the sanctum above. Behind him, reality tore in strips. Before him, every surviving word-bearer fell prostrate or died trying. He looked upon the shattered focus, upon the dead engine, upon the ruin where a sector-spanning sermon had just been strangled in its crib, and something in the very atmosphere of Sicarus recoiled from his anger. Tyberos hauled himself upright from the wreckage. The world was breaking beneath them. The sky was war and shipwreck. The cathedral was a grave. The gospel was ash. And Lorgar Aurelian fixed his gaze upon the wounded Carcharodon lord and began to hunt him through the ruins. Tyberos did not flee. Flight implied fear, confusion, disorder, some collapse of the will before a greater terror. What he did in the ruins of the gospel engine was simpler and far more honest. He cut a path away from a god. The demon cathedral city was dying around him. Sanctum vaults split and tipped into red gulges of script-lit fire. Processional bridges folded into the chasms below, like paper thrust into furnace mouths. Tower chains snapped one after another in the smoke, and sent whole hanging basilicas crashing through the bruised air to burst apart against the lower terraces in storms of brass, masonry, and praying flesh. Every avenue of Sicarus had become a throat trying to swallow itself. Through it all, the Shade Lord moved with one ruined lens, cracked plate, leaking blood, and the ancient murder logic that had kept his breed alive in the void between doomed stars. He never wasted motion. A demon burst from a split reliquary wall in a lashing knot of horn and scripture-bound sinew. Tyberos did not slow. His claw went through its face and out the back of its skull. He tore sideways, opened its torso, stepped through the spray of black ichor, and kept advancing before the carcass hit the ground. A red armored veteran swung a chain blade at his neck from a toppled stair. Tyberos caught the blow on his shattered shoulder, let the teeth bite and snag, then drove his chain fist up through the legionary's sternum until the weapon burst from the backplate in a column of meat and sparks. He left the corpse hanging there and moved on. Behind him came Lorgar. That was the difference between them. Tyberos was terrible because he reduced existence to killing angles, blood loss, distance, and the next obstruction to be pulped out of his way. Lorgar was terrible because the world agreed with him. The Primarch did not need to sprint, roar, or heave himself after prey in the manner of lesser monsters. He advanced like divine judgment, each step accepted by stone, smoke, fire, and the wound howling in reality above the city. Where his gaze fell, walls bent. Where his hand lifted, air thickened into force. Where his voice moved, distances opened or folded, turning avenues into prisons and rubble into kneeling shapes. Tyberos crossed a fracture, bridged by the broken hull of a shrine crawler. 3 surviving Red Brethren came with him, one limping hard, one trailing his left arm by a knot of cabling and tendon, one blackened across the breastplate by warp fire. Behind them, another knot of Carcharodons took position in the breach mouth they had just abandoned. They said nothing over the vox. There was nothing to say. They turned to face the dark behind them and opened fire as demons and possessed elites surged through the collapsing vault. Their last transmission was not a plea or a report. It was merely the clipped discharge count of their remaining magazines, spoken as fact while the line was overrun. Tyberos did not look back. More moments were bought in the same currency all across the broken city. A kill pack took a shattered bell tower and held its spiral interior against Ashen Circle survivors and skin-winged abominations until the whole tower peeled away from its foundations and took attackers and defenders alike into the abyss. Another pack locked down a processional avenue so Tekahurangi could drag wounded librarians through the remains of a choir cloister. They fired until their bolters clicked empty, then fought with knives, broken stock housings, gauntlets, and their own severed limbs when it came to that. Victory was not possible. They were spending themselves like the last rounds in a failing gun to give their lord meters and seconds. Tekahurangi staggered at the center of the withdrawal, if such a word could still be used for the butchery underway. The chief librarian's mind had become a battlefield more ravaged than any district of Sicarus. Memories had burned out of him in the effort to stain Lorgar's sight and invert the ritual below. Whole years were gone. Brothers he had once known only returned to him as blank places in the shape of names. Some of his own rights had become holes. Yet he walked, because the work had not done with him. He kept one gauntlet pressed to a shard taken from the dead engine, a black gold splinter of the transmission focus still wrapped in shivering script fire. It had lodged in the wreckage when Tyberos destroyed the heart of the gospel. Now it whispered in broken lines, revealing fragments of what the Primarch had meant to speak across the rift. The thing was hot enough to char ceramite. Tekahurangi held it anyway, and followed its resonance through the city's convulsions. "This way," he hissed across the command channel, though his voice came thinner each time. "Not the streets. The streets are reciting. Through the archivums. Through the old Marrow Vault." Tyberos obeyed at once, not because he trusted the sanity of the Psyker, but because he trusted the utility of his ruin. They drove through a district of collapsing scriptoria, where book towers spilled skin-bound volumes into floods of black water and ash. Servitor scribes still chained to their desks clawed at the passing Carcharodons, with quills turned inward through their own palms. A living corridor tried to close around them, its walls of stitched hide flexing inward with wet intent, bronze ribs grinding together like teeth. Tyberos rammed his chain fist into one wall, tore open a wound broad enough for his warriors to pass, and the corridor screamed in 100 flayed human voices as they forced their way out. Above them, the sky war worsened. Ships burned through the cloud mantle trailing atmosphere and the shrieks of breached populations. A word-bearer's cruiser, broken in half, fell from orbit in a lazy and majestic arc, its interior cathedra visible through the torn hull, cultists still kneeling. Within, as it descended toward annihilation, Lances stabbed down from embattled warships to vaporize anti-ship towers or rival boarding claws. Macro shells from the ground reached upward and burst against void shields in blossoms of hateful light. The whole firmament had become a ceiling of shipwreck, scripture flame, and dying stars. Takahurangi halted in the Marrow Vault beneath a collapsed Saint Bridge and forced his failing consciousness outward one last time. The vault had once been some kind of reliquary for the bones of the world's earliest martyrs. Now its walls sweated red condensation, and every niche contained not bone, but trapped after-images of mouths trying to speak. Warp sickness rippled through the chamber in visible layers, making distances throb and archways move where archways should not move. It was a wound in the city, and therefore a possible gate. The chief librarian planted his stave, lifted the stolen shard, and spoke the counter-litany. He did not speak. It well. Parts of the rite had already burned out of him. He had to drag some lines from the shard itself and others from instinct deeper than memory. Each syllable flayed a little more from what remained of his mind. Blood streamed from every seam of his helm. One eye burst and ran hot down his cheek. The Marrow Vault answered by opening. Not a true portal, not a clean translation point. A path. A dying corridor through the warp-sick folds of Sicarus, leading toward the one place where a surviving extraction claw still waited under the guns of a shattered bastion field. The opened way was visible only as a narrow seam of less impossible darkness running through the vault wall, and beyond it, through places no sane geometry would have allowed to connect. Takahurangi nearly fell. A red brother caught him. The librarian shoved him away with surprising strength. "Take the path now," he snarled. "I cannot hold its shape and be a man at once." Tyberos stared at him through his one remaining bright lens. The Psyker laughed once, a sound as raw as open nerves. "Go, Shade Lord. I have forgotten too much to fear what comes after." They went. The path held only because Takahurangi died by increments to feed it. Corridors twisted. Doors appeared where ruins had been moments before. Staircases descended through walls and emerged on impossible exterior ledges. Whole packs of demons reached for the Carcharodons from side passages that existed only when glanced at directly, but the Loyalists killed whatever blocked the line and never broke stride. Behind them, the librarian's voice kept rising and failing and rising again, every phrase more ragged, more stripped of self, until his speech no longer sounded like one man, but like many dead librarians forced to share a single throat. At the midpoint of that terrible passage, Lorgar's chosen guard found them. They emerged from both sides of a ruined archive bridge, suspended over a city chasm full of fire and falling shrines. Word-bearers in blackened crimson, taller and broader than the Legion's ordinary elite, each marked by relic chains, scripture brands, and the cold confidence of those who had stood nearest the Primarch for millennia of damnation. Possessed nobles strode with them, not rabid but regal, their mutations wrought into horrific harmony with their armor. At their rear came a wing of ashen circle remnants, trailing soot and burning propellant like funeral seraphs. Tyberos halted. There was nowhere else to place the stand. No better killing ground. No more time to be bought by others. He handed the stolen shard to the nearest surviving Red Brother and stepped into the center of the bridge. What followed would be remembered by those few who saw it as a thing beyond skill, beyond fury, beyond even the engineered ferocity of the Adeptus Astartes. Tyberos fought as the void itself might fight if given claws and grief. The first chosen came with twin blades raised. Tyberos took both forearms off at the elbow, rammed his shoulder into the warrior's chest, hard enough to cave the breastplate inward, then finished him by grinding the chain fist through helm and spine in the same downward motion. An ashen circle killer dropped from above. Tyberos caught him mid-descent, tore one jump pack wing clear, and used the still-burning wreckage to bludgeon another chosen into the bridge parapet, until head, helm, and upper torso collapsed into pulp. A possessed champion leapt the chasm side and slammed into Tyberos from the flank, talons punching through already cracked plate. The Shade Lord took the hit, locked one arm around the creature's neck, and ripped until the whole head came away in a shower of vertebrae and arterial black. His surviving brothers fought around him and died around him. One held the left parapet against three chosen until a Crozius blow split his gorget and his blood painted the bridge in hot jets. Another lost both legs to a demon. Pike and dragged himself forward on his elbows to detonate a melter charge under the feet of the attackers clustering above him. The stolen shard changed hands twice as its bearers fell, each brother making sure it moved onward before his own killing ended. Then Lorgar came to the bridge. The chosen fell back just enough to grant their lord room. He advanced through the bodies of his own guard and the hacked remains of Carcharodons alike, black blood from his earlier wound still cooling in lines across his side. Fire moved in his wake. The chasm beneath answered his presence by vomiting up script flame. He looked upon the bridge and the carnage, and Tyberos standing at its center with armor broken open in half a dozen places, and there was no anger on his face now, only a grim and terrible recognition. "You do not know how to stop," Lorgar said. Tyberos answered with action, because that was all he had left worth giving. He charged through the last of the chosen, carving one, apart from groin to collar, smashing another from the bridge with a backhand that spun the corpse down into the fire below, then hurling himself straight at the Primarch. Lorgar spoke a single word, and the bridge stones tried to kneel, but Tyberos was already in motion, driving through the warping pressure by brute will and ruined hydraulics. The chain fist hit first, and Lorgar turned enough that the teeth chewed through pauldron and upper arm instead of neck. Black blood fountained in smoking ropes. Tyberos's claw followed into the old wound along the Primarch's side, widening it, tearing armor, flesh, and relic chains in one savage rake. Lorgar struck back with his bare hand. The blow lifted Tyberos from his feet and hurled him half the length of the bridge. 3 ribs shattered, 1 lung collapsed. His armor screamed at every joint. He landed, rolled, rose again, because there was nothing else in him except the habit of continuing. The Red Brother carrying the shard reached the far end of the bridge. "Now," Te Kahurangi voxed, though the word came from far away, from a mouth almost already lost. The opened path shuddered into being beyond the Archivum gate, a flare of impossible dusk across the shattered bastion court, where the extraction claw waited with engines burning and guns still firing into the press of pursuing demons. Tyberos backed toward it step by bloodied step, killing whatever came close enough to threaten the shard. He was no longer withdrawing. He was dragging proof out of damnation. Lorgar did not pursue at once. He looked at the black blood on his hand where Tyberos had marked him again. He looked at the dying chosen, the ruined bridge, the escaping relic fragment bearing words stolen from the unborn sermon. When he spoke, his voice rolled over the broken city and through every open channel still functioning in the loyalist line. "Go then, executioner of a dead empire. Carry your warning into the dark. Carry your little theft, and the scar you have earned in my sight. You have broken a mouth, not the truth that seeks speech. There will come another hour, and in that hour I will teach your species the shape of what it refused at Monarchia." Tyberos reached the threshold of the opened path and stopped long enough to look back once through his ruined helm. Lorgar inclined his head by the smallest degree. "A worthy killer," the Primarch said. "We will meet again." Then the path collapsed between them. Te Kahurangi had nothing left after that. The surviving Carcharodons found him in the marrow vault on his knees, still gripping the stave, his helm split, one eye gone, the other staring at things far beyond the chamber walls. He had opened the dying way, held it, and paid for it in memory, language, and whatever unbroken parts of the soul remained to a librarian who had touched a Primarch's thought too often in too short a span. When Tyberos knelt before him, the Psyker seemed not to know him. He smiled anyway, faintly, as if at some half-remembered brother from another century. "Did we silence it?" he whispered. "For now," Tyberos said. Takahurangi's smile widened just enough to show blood on his teeth. Then whatever remained of his consciousness broke apart like frost under gunfire. His body lived. The man within it went elsewhere. The extraction claw tore skyward from Sicarus under flak, warp fire, and falling debris. It carried fewer warriors than had entered the city by a cruel margin. Below it, the demon world came apart in widening rings of collapse. Cathedral chains snapped, districts fell. The ruined inner sanctum sank into the opened core like a diseased tooth driven back into the gum. Above it all, fleet actions still burned in orbit, though many of the ships engaged no longer had bridges, crews, or functioning names. The Carcharodon fleet escaped the eye savaged and half-ruined. One battle barge limped with a third of its engines dead and whole. Decks vented to the void. 2 strike cruisers did not answer muster at all, and were marked as lost with all hands, somewhere amid the warp storms and wreckage around Sicarus. Boarding casualties gutted several companies. Mortal crews had been spent in appalling volume. Gene seed reliquaries were fuller than the living barracks. The ships that survived carried silence heavier than triumph, for there was no honest victory to celebrate in what they had done. Yet the stolen shard endured. Locked within warded adamant and sanctified hate, it was studied by those few surviving minds among the fleet's librarians and cryptologians who still possessed enough coherence to read it. What it revealed curdled whatever satisfaction the mission might have claimed. The sermon intended for Sicarus had indeed died unborn. The synchronized apostasy, seeded across the targeted sectors, faltered without its central mouth. Shrine worlds that might have erupted in coordinated revelation instead lapsed into isolated cult violence, terrible but containable by the Imperium's usual brutal standards. Whole regions of human space were spared immediate collapse into a single shared heresy. But the shard held more than the ruined draft of one gospel. It spoke of pulpits. Many. Sicarus had not been unique, only foremost. Other worlds, other engines, other choirs and doctrinal furnaces were being raised across the dark, under names not yet fully deciphered. The Primarch had not wagered everything on one sanctum. He had tested a method. One mouth had been cut out. Others would be built. Far behind the retreating fleet, amid the ruins of the shattered inner cathedral, Lorgar stood unbowed. Black blood cooled on his skin and armor where Tyberos had scarred him. Around him, survivors of the Word-Bearers host crawled from the wreckage or knelt where they had landed in the fallout of failure and revelation. The city still burned. The world still cracked. Great portions of his work had died, shrieking beneath the backlash of the broken engine. None of it changed the certainty in his gaze. Malak Vol was dead. The old sermon was ash. The chosen guards lay in hacked heaps where the Void Hunter had made his last stand. Lorgar looked upon all of it with the patience of a being for whom catastrophe and scripture had long ago become nearly synonymous. He began to dictate, not loudly, not as a rant hurled at the uncaring heavens, calmly, precisely, as though resuming a text interrupted by some minor noise. Surviving scribes, blood-blind and trembling, dragged themselves forward with broken styluses and skin scrolls. Legionaries knelt to hear. Demons quieted at the edge of the light. The Primarch spoke a new sequence into being, incorporating the loss, the wound, the theft, the hunter, the bridge of dead guards, the ruined engine, all of it becoming fresh liturgy beneath his measured tongue. Tyberos had halted the sermon. He had not halted the prophet.